Welcome to the Sleepy Scribe. Your endless internet wandering has brought you here, and hopefully you can finally sleep. Now before we begin, comment where you are listening and how late it is for you, and also subscribe, it is very appreciated. Let us begin. The rise of the Knights Templar began in the early 12th century, born from the chaos and bloodshed of the First Crusade. In 1119, 2 decades after Jerusalem fell to the Crusaders, a French knight named Hugues de Payens approached King Baldwin II of Jerusalem with a proposal. He and 8 fellow knights would dedicate themselves to protecting Christian pilgrims traveling the dangerous roads of the Holy Land. Baldwin granted them quarters in a wing of the royal palace, built atop the ruins of the Temple of Solomon, and so the poor fellow soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon were formed. Their numbers were small, their resources few, but their mission was clear. They took vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, living as warrior monks bound by religious duty. What began as a modest order soon gained prestige. In 1129, at the Council of Troyes, the Church formally endorsed the Templars. Their rule, inspired by that of the Cistercians, emphasized discipline, austerity, and unwavering loyalty. With papal backing, they were granted extraordinary privileges. They answered only to the Pope, paid no taxes, and were free from local laws. Donations poured in. Nobles offered land, money, and sons eager to serve. By the mid-12th century, the Templars had grown into a formidable force, with commanderies stretching from England to the Holy Land. Their white mantles marked with red crosses became symbols of both piety and fear. On the battlefield, they were relentless. Trained from youth, they charged in disciplined ranks, often holding the line when others broke. In the East, they helped defend Crusader states like the Kingdom of Jerusalem and the Principality of Anch. At home, they built fortresses, managed estates, and oversaw one of the most sophisticated financial networks in medieval Europe. The Templars pioneered early banking techniques, allowing pilgrims and nobles to deposit money in one location and withdraw it in another. Their efficiency and integrity made them trusted custodians of wealth. Kings and popes alike used their services. Despite their success, tensions simmered. Some questioned the morality of warrior monks. Others envied their wealth and autonomy. In Islamic lands, they were both feared and hated. Yet in these early years, the Templars stood at the height of their power, a rare fusion of sword and faith, forging an identity that would shape the legends and conspiracies surrounding them for centuries. The reign of Charlemagne marked a pivotal transformation in the medieval West. Crowned Emperor of the Romans by Pope Leo III in the year 800, Charlemagne's coronation symbolized the revival of imperial power in Western Europe centuries after the collapse of the Western Roman Empire. His dominion stretched across what is now France, Germany, the Low Countries, northern Italy, and parts of Central Europe. But his rule was not defined merely by conquest. Charlemagne pursued a vision of unity built on Christian faith, centralized authority, and learning. His court at Aachen became a hub for what historians later called the Carolingian Renaissance, a period of intellectual revival that aimed to standardize Christian practice and preserve classical knowledge. Latin texts were recopied, monasteries became centers of learning, and literacy among clergy improved. However, Charlemagne's empire remained a fragile patchwork, held together by loyalty oaths, appointed counts, and the emperor's personal authority. Communication across such a vast realm was slow and uncertain. The missi dominici, royal envoys, traveled constantly to supervise local administration and enforce royal will. Justice, often delivered in open-air assemblies, blended old Germanic customs with Roman legal traditions and Christian morality. Despite these efforts, the empire was not immune to internal fractures. Upon Charlemagne's death in 814, his son Louis the Pious inherited an empire already strained by regional identities and noble ambitions. Louis attempted to maintain unity, but his reign was marred by rebellions and a growing tendency among Frankish rulers to divide land among heirs. This culminated in the Treaty of Verdun in 843, when Charlemagne's grandsons split the empire into 3 parts: West Francia, East Francia, and Middle Francia. This division laid the foundation for modern France and Germany. Meanwhile, external threats grew. Viking raids along the northern coasts, Saracen incursions from the south, and Magyar invasions in the east all exposed the weaknesses of the fragmented Carolingian order. Local lords, better positioned to defend their regions than distant kings, built fortifications and amassed private armies. This shift marked the gradual rise of feudalism, a decentralized political structure where loyalty and service were exchanged for protection and land. Castles, once rare, became central features of the medieval landscape. As the Carolingian legacy faded, the power vacuum it left behind shaped the next phase of medieval Europe, one dominated not by emperors but by dukes, counts, bishops, and knights, all vying for control in a world where law, land, and loyalty were inseparable. As the Carolingian Empire fractured and localized power grew, the feudal system matured into the dominant structure of medieval European society. At its core was the relationship between lord and vassal, bound by mutual obligation. A nobleman, often a powerful landholder, would grant a fief, a piece of land, to a vassal in exchange for military service and loyalty. This system created a complex web of allegiances that extended from kings to the lowest knights. Peasants, or serfs, worked the land, bound to it by birth and custom, owing labor and a portion of their harvest in return for protection. While serfdom was not slavery, it offered little freedom. The manor became the center of daily life, a self-sustaining unit where agriculture dictated rhythms, and the seasons governed existence. The manor house, church, fields, and mills formed the physical heart of medieval rural society. Life was hard, but predictable. Beyond the countryside, the church continued to shape every aspect of medieval life. It provided not only spiritual guidance but also education, record-keeping, and legal authority. Monasteries flourished, preserving ancient texts, producing manuscripts, and offering refuge to the sick and poor. Monastic orders such as the Benedictines set rules for communal living, emphasizing prayer, labor, and study. Meanwhile, the papacy increasingly asserted its authority, claiming supremacy over all Christendom. The power struggle between popes and kings became a recurring theme. Nowhere was this clearer than in the investiture controversy of the 11th century, when Pope Gregory VII clashed with Holy Roman Emperor Henry IV over who held the right to appoint bishops. The Pope excommunicated the emperor, who in turn made a public penance at Canossa in 1077, a humbling moment that symbolized the growing power of the Church. At the same time, new threats and opportunities emerged. In 1095, Pope Urban II called for the First Crusade, urging Christian knights to retake Jerusalem from Muslim control. The response was overwhelming. Nobles, knights, and commoners alike took the cross, driven by faith, ambition, and the promise of eternal reward. The Crusades marked a dramatic shift in medieval Europe's gaze, outward toward the Holy Land and the Islamic world. While the First Crusade achieved its goal with the capture of Jerusalem in 1099, it also ignited centuries of religious warfare and cultural exchange. European knights encountered advanced Islamic science, medicine, and architecture, bringing home ideas that would slowly transform the West. But the cost was enormous. The Crusades drained resources, intensified religious hatred, and deepened the rift between Latin and Eastern Christianity. In parallel, towns began to rise in importance. Trade revived along old Roman routes and new markets flourished. Merchant guilds, skilled artisans, and chartered cities laid the foundation for a burgeoning middle class. The balance of power began to shift. Wealth no longer flowed only from land but also from commerce, especially in places like Venice, Genoa, and Bruges. The medieval world was evolving, not just through war or piety, but through trade, learning, and the assertion of new voices within the old feudal order. The growth of medieval towns created new social dynamics that challenged traditional feudal structures. These burgeoning urban centers attracted peasants seeking freedom from manorial obligations and serfs hoping for a chance at a different life. Towns offered charters, legal documents granting rights and privileges, often negotiated with local lords or kings. These charters allowed towns to govern themselves, levy taxes, and establish markets. As towns grew, so did the influence of the merchant class. Guilds organized craftspeople and traders, regulating quality, prices, and training through apprenticeships. Guild members enjoyed protection and a voice in civic affairs, marking the rise of a new social order between nobility and peasantry. The universities that began to appear in cities such as Bologna, Paris, and Oxford reflected this new intellectual spirit. Rooted in cathedral schools, universities taught the liberal arts, theology, law, and medicine. Scholars debated the works of Aristotle, rediscovered through Arabic translations, sparking the scholastic movement which sought to reconcile faith and reason. Thinkers like Thomas Aquinas argued that reason and divine revelation were compatible, shaping medieval Christian philosophy for centuries. Meanwhile, the architecture of the era symbolized both spiritual devotion and civic pride. The Gothic style emerged in the 12th century, characterized by pointed arches, flying buttresses, and vast stained-glass windows. Cathedrals like Chartres, Notre Dame de Paris, and Salisbury Cathedral rose toward the heavens, inspiring awe and devotion. These monumental buildings required the cooperation of skilled masons, artisans, and patrons, reflecting the interconnectedness of medieval society. Politically, the period saw the gradual consolidation of royal authority, particularly in England and France. The Norman conquest of England in 1066 brought new administrative reforms, including the Domesday Book, a detailed survey of landholdings and resources that allowed more effective taxation. English kings like Henry II expanded royal courts and legal systems, laying foundations for common law. In France, the Capetian dynasty steadily increased its control over fragmented territories through diplomacy, marriage, and warfare. At the same time, the Holy Roman Empire remained a patchwork of duchies, bishoprics, and principalities, with emperors often struggling to assert dominance over powerful nobles and the papacy. Warfare remained constant, shaped by the demands of feudal loyalties and territorial ambitions. Knights, heavily armored and trained from youth, became symbols of martial prowess and chivalric ideals. Tournaments offered a stage for display and competition, blending sport and military training. Codes of chivalry emphasized honor, loyalty, and protection of the weak, though in practice the reality was often brutal and pragmatic. Castles dotted the landscape, serving as fortresses, noble residences, and administrative centers. These stone structures were engineered for defense with thick walls, towers, moats, and murder holes. They embodied the militarized nature of medieval society and the constant threat of conflict, whether from rival lords, foreign invaders, or peasant uprisings. The Black Death, which would arrive in the 14th century, loomed beyond this period, ready to transform medieval Europe in unimaginable ways. But by the 12th and 13th centuries, the medieval world was a tapestry of war, faith, learning, and growth, complex and often contradictory, setting the stage for the changes that would lead to the early modern era. The relationship between the medieval church and state was a defining feature of the era, shaping politics, culture, and society. The church held immense power, both spiritual and temporal, influencing kings and commoners alike. Popes claimed authority over all Christians, asserting supremacy even over monarchs, leading to frequent conflicts. One of the most famous clashes was the investiture controversy, a struggle over who held the right to appoint bishops, the Pope or the King. This dispute between Pope Gregory VII and Emperor Henry IV in the late 11th century culminated in Henry's dramatic penance at Canossa, symbolizing the tension between religious and secular powers. Beyond politics, the Church was a unifying force in medieval life. The calendar revolved around religious festivals, and the sacraments marked key moments from birth to death. Monasteries served as centers of learning, preserving classical texts and producing manuscripts by hand. Monks and nuns provided education, medical care, and hospitality to travelers. The rise of new religious orders like the Cistercians and Franciscans reflected evolving spiritual needs. The Franciscans, founded by Saint Francis of Assisi, embraced poverty and simplicity, preaching to the poor and emphasizing personal devotion. The Crusades were a direct consequence of the Church's desire to reclaim the Holy Land and unite Christendom. Starting in 1096, a series of military campaigns called by popes drew knights, peasants, and nobles from across Europe. The First Crusade succeeded in capturing Jerusalem in 1099, establishing Crusader states. However, subsequent crusades were marked by failure, internal conflicts, and shifting priorities. The Fourth Crusade's diversion to sack Constantinople in 1204 deepened the divide between the Western and Eastern Christian worlds. The Crusades also had lasting impacts on trade, culture, and knowledge. Contact with the Byzantine Empire and Muslim lands introduced Europeans to new goods like spices, textiles, and scientific ideas. Cities such as Venice and Genoa flourished as trading hubs. The transmission of knowledge included advancements in medicine, mathematics, and philosophy, sparking the beginnings of the Renaissance. In everyday life, the medieval peasantry formed the backbone of society. Most people lived in rural villages under the authority of local lords, working the land in exchange for protection and a portion of their crops. Life was harsh and labor-intensive, with seasons dictating the rhythm of work. Peasants were bound by customs and obligations, but they also enjoyed community traditions, festivals, and religious observances. Over time, some peasants gained freedoms or rights, leading to gradual social changes. Medieval art and literature reflected the values and experiences of the time. Illuminated manuscripts, richly decorated with gold and vibrant colors, preserved religious texts and chronicles. Epic poems like the Song of Roland and romances celebrated heroic deeds and courtly love, blending history and myth. Troubadours and minstrels entertained with music and stories, preserving oral traditions. Gothic cathedrals themselves were expressions of faith and community, with sculptures and stained glass telling biblical stories to largely illiterate populations. Medicine in the medieval period was a blend of ancient knowledge, superstition, and religious belief. Physicians relied on texts from Hippocrates and Galen but also consulted astrological charts. Illness was often seen as a punishment from God or the result of imbalanced humors. Treatments included herbal remedies, bloodletting, and prayer. Hospitals run by religious orders offered care, though understanding of disease was limited. Despite hardships and conflicts, the medieval period was a time of vibrant cultural and intellectual activity. It laid foundations for modern Europe through its institutions, art, philosophy, and evolving social structures. The interplay between faith, power, and daily life created a complex world where tradition and change coexisted, setting the stage for future transformations. Feudalism was the dominant social and economic system of medieval Europe, structuring society around relationships derived from the holding of land in exchange for service and labor. At its core was the lord-vassal relationship, where a noble granted land, known as a fief, to a vassal, who in return pledged loyalty, military service, and counsel. This network of mutual obligations created a hierarchy that extended from kings at the top to peasants and serfs at the bottom. Kings granted large territories to powerful nobles who ruled over them almost like miniature monarchs, administering justice, collecting taxes, and raising armies. Knights, often vassals themselves, served their lords as heavily armored cavalry, embodying the martial ideal of the age. Their code of chivalry emphasized bravery, loyalty, and honor, though in practice the realities of warfare and politics were often more pragmatic and brutal. Below the knights were peasants and serfs who worked the land. Serfs were bound to the manor and owed labor and dues to their lord, though they were not slaves and had some rights under customary law. Their lives were centered on farming, and they endured hard work, poor living conditions, and the constant threat of famine and disease. The manorial system, a key component of feudalism, was the economic backbone of medieval life. The manor was a self-sufficient estate including the lord's residence, peasant villages, farmland, forests, and pastures. Peasants grew crops such as wheat, barley, oats, and vegetables, raised livestock, and produced goods like wool. The manor provided most necessities for daily life, limiting the need for trade in many regions. Despite its rigidity, feudalism was not uniform across Europe. Variations existed based on local customs, geography, and the strength of royal authority. In England, the Norman conquest of 1066 centralized power under William the Conqueror, who introduced a more structured feudal hierarchy documented in the Domesday Book. In France and Germany, competing nobles often challenged royal power, leading to fragmented and fluid political landscapes. Over the centuries, feudalism evolved. The growth of towns and trade in the High Middle Ages began to challenge the manor's self-sufficiency. Wealth from commerce gave rise to a new class of merchants and artisans, the bourgeoisie, who lived in walled towns and operated under charters granting limited freedoms from feudal obligations. This economic shift began to undermine the traditional social order. The Hundred Years' War between England and France further accelerated changes. The development of professional armies and the use of gunpowder weapons diminished the military role of knights and the feudal levi. Monarchs consolidated power, weakening noble independence. At the same time, peasant revolts and social unrest indicated growing tensions within the system. Feudalism's legacy is complex. It shaped medieval Europe's political structures and social relations for centuries, embedding a system of hierarchy and obligation that influenced law, landholding, and governance. While often seen as a rigid and oppressive system, it also provided order and stability in a fragmented world. Its decline paved the way for the rise of centralized nation-states and the modern era's social and economic transformations. The medieval church was a dominant force in European life during the Middle Ages, influencing spiritual, political, and cultural realms. The Catholic Church was not just a religious institution but a powerful political entity with vast landholdings, wealth, and influence that extended across kingdoms. The Pope, based in Rome, was regarded as the supreme spiritual leader of Christendom, claiming authority over kings and emperors alike. This claim often led to conflicts between secular rulers and the Church, exemplified by disputes such as the investiture controversy, where emperors and popes clashed over who had the right to appoint bishops and abbots. The Church's hierarchy mirrored feudal structures, with the Pope at the top, followed by cardinals, archbishops, bishops, priests, and monks. Monasticism played a crucial role, with monasteries serving as centers of learning, agriculture, and charity. Orders like the Benedictines, Cistercians, and later the Franciscans and Dominicans shaped religious life and education. The Church was also the guardian of knowledge during this period. Monks copied manuscripts, preserving classical texts and religious writings, which would later fuel the Renaissance. Cathedral schools evolved into universities, laying the foundation for higher education in Europe. The Church influenced daily life through the sacraments, festivals, and moral teachings, shaping people's worldview. The calendar was marked by holy days and saints' feast days, and pilgrimages to shrines like Santiago de Compostela were common spiritual practices. Art and architecture flourished under church patronage, leading to the construction of grand cathedrals in the Gothic style, with soaring spires, flying buttresses, and stained glass windows that conveyed biblical stories to an illiterate populace. The Church also played a role in warfare and diplomacy. The Crusades, a series of religiously motivated military campaigns, sought to reclaim the Holy Land from Muslim control and were sanctioned by the papacy. These campaigns had profound effects on European and Middle Eastern societies, promoting trade, cultural exchange, and military innovation, but also causing immense suffering and lasting animosity. Despite its power, the Church faced criticism and calls for reform. Corruption, simony, the buying and selling of church offices, and the moral failings of clergy led to movements like the Waldensians and later laid groundwork for the Protestant Reformation. The medieval church's influence permeated all aspects of life, from the birth to the death of individuals, controlling rites such as baptism, marriage, and burial. Its reach extended beyond Europe, as missionaries spread Christianity into Scandinavia and Eastern Europe, integrating diverse peoples into the Christian world. Through its spiritual authority, economic power, and cultural leadership, the medieval church shaped the trajectory of European history during the Middle Ages and beyond. The feudal system was the social and economic structure that defined medieval Europe, shaping relationships between kings, nobles, knights, and peasants. At its core was the exchange of land for loyalty and service. Kings granted large parcels of land called fiefs to powerful nobles, who in turn promised military support and counsel. These nobles, often called lords, subdivided their estates to lesser nobles or knights, who pledged to fight for their lords and maintain order on their lands. At the bottom of the hierarchy were peasants and serfs, who worked the land to produce food and goods, sustaining the entire system. Serfs were bound to the land and owed labor, rent, and various fees to their lords but were protected by the lord's authority. Life for peasants was hard and precarious, dominated by agricultural labor and subject to the demands of their overlords. The manorial system was the economic complement to feudalism, organizing rural life around self-sufficient estates called manors. Manors included the lord's residence, peasant villages, farmland, forests, and mills. The medieval church was one of the most powerful institutions of the Middle Ages, deeply influencing every aspect of life from kings to peasants. The Pope, as the head of the Roman Catholic Church, held spiritual authority believed to be granted directly by God. The Church's reach extended across Europe, transcending borders and kingdoms, uniting diverse peoples under a common faith. Cathedrals and monasteries were not only places of worship but also centers of learning, art, and charity. Monks and nuns dedicated their lives to prayer, study, and copying manuscripts, preserving classical knowledge through turbulent times. The Church's hierarchy was complex, with bishops overseeing dioceses and priests tending local parishes. It controlled vast lands and wealth, often rivaling secular rulers in power. The Church also shaped medieval culture, influencing laws, morals, and education. Pilgrimages to holy sites and the veneration of saints were important religious practices that reinforced community bonds. The Crusades, launched to reclaim the Holy Land from Muslim control, were major military and religious campaigns that highlighted the Church's role in mobilizing knights and kings for a common cause. The Church's power, however, was not without challenges. Conflicts between popes and monarchs over authority, such as the investiture controversy, exposed tensions between spiritual and temporal power. Heresies and dissent occasionally arose, leading to inquisitions and persecution. The Church's monopoly on knowledge also meant that it controlled the interpretation of scripture and doctrine, shaping the worldview of medieval people. Despite criticism and reform efforts, the medieval Church remained a dominant force, guiding the spiritual and social lives of millions and leaving a lasting legacy on European history. The feudal system was the dominant social and economic structure in medieval Europe, shaping life from the 9th to the 15th centuries. At its core, feudalism was based on the exchange of land for military service and loyalty. Kings granted large estates, or fiefs, to powerful nobles called lords. These lords, in turn, parceled out portions of their land to vassals, knights who pledged military service and allegiance. At the bottom were peasants or serfs who worked the land, providing food and labor in exchange for protection. Serfs were bound to the land and could not leave without the lord's permission, living harsh lives marked by toil and limited freedoms. The manor was the basic unit of feudal society, a self-sufficient estate where lords exercised economic and judicial control. Manorial courts settled disputes and enforced local laws. Feudal obligations created a complex web of loyalties and duties that structured medieval politics and warfare. Knights trained from childhood in the art of combat and chivalry, sworn to defend their lord and uphold a code of honor. Castles dotted the landscape, serving as fortified residences and symbols of noble power. Feudalism also influenced culture and art, with troubadours and minstrels spreading tales of courtly love and heroic deeds. While feudalism provided order and stability after the chaos of the early Middle Ages, it also entrenched social inequalities and limited mobility. Over time, economic growth, the rise of towns, and centralized monarchies challenged feudal bonds, leading to gradual transformation. Yet the legacy of feudalism remained deeply embedded in European history, shaping its social fabric for centuries. The Crusades were a series of religious wars sanctioned by the Latin Church in the medieval period, primarily between the 11th and 13th centuries. Their main goal was to reclaim Jerusalem and other holy sites in the Near East that had fallen under Muslim control. The First Crusade was launched in 1095 by Pope Urban II, who called on Christians to take up arms in response to appeals from the Byzantine Emperor Alexios I Komnenos, whose empire was threatened by the Seljuk Turks. Thousands of knights, peasants, and nobles responded, driven by religious fervor, the promise of salvation, and the lure of wealth and land. The journey to the Holy Land was perilous, marked by battles, starvation, and disease. In 1099, Crusaders captured Jerusalem after a brutal siege, establishing several Crusader states. The success inspired further campaigns, including the Second and Third Crusades, which involved notable figures like Richard the Lionheart and Saladin, the Muslim leader who recaptured Jerusalem in 1187. The Crusades had profound effects beyond the battlefield. They facilitated cultural exchanges, increased trade between Europe and the East, and spurred technological and intellectual advancements. However, they also led to widespread violence, persecution of Jewish communities, and strained relations between Christian and Muslim worlds. The later Crusades were less successful, and the movement eventually faded, but the legacy of the Crusades shaped medieval geopolitics, religious identity, and cross-cultural interactions for centuries. During the later Middle Ages, the Black Death emerged as one of the most devastating pandemics in human history, profoundly shaping medieval society and Europe's future. Beginning in the early 1340s, this bubonic plague spread rapidly across the continent, killing an estimated 25 to 30 million people, roughly one-third of Europe's population at the time. The disease was caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis, transmitted primarily through fleas carried by black rats that traveled with merchants and armies along trade routes. The plague arrived in Europe via ports such as Messina and quickly overwhelmed towns and cities. Symptoms began with fever, chills, and swollen, painful lymph nodes called buboes. Death often came within days, sometimes as quickly as 48 hours after infection. Medical knowledge was limited, and treatments were largely ineffective or harmful. The Black Death caused widespread social, economic, and religious upheaval. Labor shortages led to demands for higher wages and contributed to the decline of the feudal system as serfs and peasants gained leverage against lords. Many towns faced severe disruptions as entire households died. Fear and misunderstanding fueled persecution, with Jewish communities often scapegoated and violently attacked. The Church, unable to explain or stop the plague, saw its influence challenged, leading some to question long-held religious beliefs. However, the pandemic also led to advances in public health measures and changes in attitudes towards medicine and hygiene. Artistic and literary works from the period reflected the pervasive presence of death and suffering, influencing cultural expressions for generations. The Black Death's impact on demographics, economics, and social structures set the stage for the Renaissance and transformed medieval Europe into the early modern world. The Hundred Years' War was a prolonged conflict between England and France that lasted from 1337 to 1453. This nearly 116-year struggle fundamentally reshaped medieval Europe's political landscape and military tactics. The war began primarily over claims to the French throne, with Edward III of England asserting his right through his mother, a French princess. The French crown, however, passed to Philip VI, leading to a fierce dynastic rivalry. This conflict was not continuous warfare but consisted of several phases punctuated by periods of truce and uneasy peace. The early stages featured English dominance on the battlefield, with victories such as the Battle of Crécy in 1346 and the Battle of Poitiers in 1356, where the English used longbowmen effectively against French knights. The war devastated many French regions, leading to widespread famine and destruction. The arrival of Joan of Arc in 1429 marked a turning point. She inspired French forces to lift the siege of Orleans and helped Charles VII reclaim his throne. Her involvement symbolized a rise in French national identity and morale. Over time, the conflict evolved from a dynastic dispute into a broader struggle over territorial control and sovereignty. The war introduced new military technologies and tactics, including the increased use of gunpowder and artillery, which gradually rendered traditional knightly cavalry less dominant. By the war's end, England had lost most of its continental possessions, retaining only Calais until 1558. The Hundred Years' War also affected society beyond the battlefield, influencing taxation, governance, and national consciousness. It exposed weaknesses in feudal structures and contributed to the decline of chivalric ideals. Economically, the war strained both kingdoms but led to increased centralization of authority. The legacy of the war remains significant, as it set the stage for the emergence of modern nation-states in Europe and shaped the cultural memory of both England and France. The mid-15th century saw the decline of feudalism and the rise of stronger centralized monarchies in Europe, a transformation accelerated by the lingering effects of the Hundred Years' War. As England and France emerged from the conflict, both kingdoms underwent significant political and social changes. In England, the war's end contributed to internal strife, most notably the Wars of the Roses, a dynastic civil war between the houses of Lancaster and York. This conflict arose partly due to the weakened authority of the monarchy after years of expensive overseas campaigns and shifting loyalties among the nobility. The wars devastated the English nobility and altered the monarchy's structure, ultimately culminating in the rise of the Tudor dynasty with Henry VII's victory in 1485. In France, the aftermath of the Hundred Years' War fostered a resurgence of royal authority. Charles VII implemented reforms that improved tax collection and administration, consolidating power in the hands of the king. The war had also sparked a stronger sense of French national identity, fueled by figures like Joan of Arc and the collective struggle against foreign invasion. Beyond these political shifts, Europe in the 15th century witnessed economic growth and cultural revival, setting the stage for the Renaissance. Trade expanded, especially in Italian city-states like Florence and Venice, where wealth from commerce funded artistic and intellectual achievements. Advances in technology, such as the printing press invented by Johannes Gutenberg around 1440, revolutionized the dissemination of knowledge. This period also saw the rise of humanism, an intellectual movement that emphasized the study of classical texts and the potential of human reason. The late medieval period was a time of transition marked by both continuity and change. Feudal ties slowly loosened, towns and cities grew, and monarchs centralized authority, setting the foundation for the modern states that would dominate Europe in the coming centuries. These developments intertwined with the legacies of war, religion, and cultural exchange to create a complex historical tapestry. By the late 15th century, the age of exploration was beginning to reshape Europe's view of the world and its place in it. Driven by a combination of economic ambition, religious zeal, and technological innovation, European powers sought new trade routes and territories beyond the traditional boundaries of Christendom. Portugal and Spain led the charge, funded by monarchs eager to expand their influence and wealth. Portuguese navigators like Prince Henry the Navigator sponsored voyages along the African coast, gradually mapping its contours and establishing trading posts. This era witnessed the gradual improvement of navigational tools, including the magnetic compass and the astrolabe, enabling sailors to venture further into the open ocean with increasing confidence. Meanwhile, Spain, united under Ferdinand and Isabella, sought to compete with Portugal's successes. Their sponsorship of Christopher Columbus's 1492 voyage led to the unexpected encounter with the Americas, an event that would alter global history. The medieval mindset, heavily influenced by religious doctrines and limited geographical knowledge, struggled to comprehend the vastness and diversity of the new lands and peoples encountered. The encounters brought about profound consequences, including the spread of European diseases to indigenous populations, the beginning of transatlantic slave trade, and the establishment of colonial empires. These developments marked the end of the medieval world in many respects, as the expansion into the Atlantic and beyond opened new economic and cultural frontiers. Back in Europe, the Renaissance flourished, fueled by the rediscovery of classical antiquity and the influx of wealth from overseas ventures. Art, science, and philosophy advanced rapidly, challenging old ideas and promoting new ways of thinking. The printing press facilitated the spread of these ideas, contributing to growing literacy and the eventual questioning of religious and political authority. Simultaneously, the Catholic Church faced internal challenges that would culminate in the Reformation of the 16th century, signaling further transformation. Thus, the late medieval period blended the fading traditions of the feudal and religious order with the emerging forces of global exploration, intellectual inquiry, and state building, setting the stage for the early modern era. The Hundred Years' War, spanning from 1337 to 1453, was a prolonged and complex conflict between the kingdoms of England and France, rooted in disputes over territorial claims and the French crown's succession. It was not a continuous war but a series of conflicts, truces, and political maneuverings that reflected the shifting alliances and power struggles of medieval Europe. The war began when Edward III of England asserted his claim to the French throne after the death of Charles IV, the last direct Capetian king, challenging Philip VI's succession and sparking a dynastic rivalry. The English possessed strong military advantages early on, notably the longbow, which proved devastating in battles such as Crécy, 1346, and Poitiers, 1356, where English forces defeated larger French armies through tactical innovation and disciplined archery. However, the war also coincided with the catastrophic outbreak of the Black Death, which decimated populations and altered the social and economic structures of both kingdoms. This plague disrupted armies, reduced manpower, and contributed to periods of truce. The war deeply impacted medieval society, accelerating the decline of feudalism as monarchs increasingly relied on professional armies and taxation. It also fostered a sense of national identity in both England and France. French resurgence came under leaders like Joan of Arc, whose inspirational role during the Siege of Orleans in 1429 reinvigorated French morale and contributed to turning the tide in favor of Charles VII. Joan, claiming divine guidance, symbolized the merging of religious fervor and nationalist sentiment. The eventual French victory in 1453, with the English expelled from most continental territories except Calais, marked the end of medieval military dominance by chivalric knights and heralded new forms of warfare, including the increasing use of gunpowder and artillery. The war's conclusion also set the stage for the rise of centralized monarchies and the modern nation-state. Throughout this turbulent period, the war's effects rippled across Europe, influencing art, literature, and politics. It exemplified the complexities of medieval power struggles, where personal dynastic claims, economic interests, and evolving military technology intertwined to reshape the medieval world. The Hundred Years' War continued to define the mid-15th century as both England and France endured immense strain from decades of conflict. After the inspirational rise of Joan of Arc and the subsequent lifting of the Siege of Orleans in 1429, French forces began reclaiming lost territories with renewed vigor. Joan's capture in 1430 and execution by the English, however, turned her into a martyr, further galvanizing French resistance. Meanwhile, English fortunes waned due to internal political conflicts and the loss of key territories. The French adopted new strategies, increasingly relying on artillery and fortified positions that gradually undermined the English advantage in open battle. The economic cost of the war was immense, draining royal coffers and destabilizing feudal systems, forcing both kingdoms to innovate in governance and military organization. The conflict saw the rise of professional soldiers and a gradual shift away from feudal levies. By the 1440s, the English found themselves confined to a few enclaves, with the French launching decisive campaigns to expel them. The Battle of Castillon in 1453 marked the war's final major engagement, where French artillery decimated English forces, effectively ending English ambitions in France. This defeat coincided with the broader decline of English influence on the continent, signaling a turning point in European geopolitics. The war's end allowed France to emerge as a more unified and centralized state under Charles VII, while England turned inward, facing its own dynastic struggles known as the Wars of the Roses. Beyond the battlefield, the Hundred Years' War reshaped medieval society by accelerating changes in warfare, governance, and national consciousness. It underscored the waning power of the medieval knight and heralded the rise of infantry and gunpowder weapons, which would dominate future conflicts. The war's legacy is reflected in the emergence of modern European states and a transformed political landscape that laid the groundwork for the Renaissance and early modern period. The political landscape of 15th-century Europe was in constant flux, with the decline of feudalism giving rise to powerful centralized monarchies. France, still healing from the devastation of the Hundred Years' War, began rebuilding its economy and infrastructure, focusing on strengthening royal authority over rebellious nobles. The monarchy sought to reduce the power of feudal lords by establishing a standing army loyal to the crown, which marked a significant shift from the traditional reliance on noble levies. This period also witnessed the growth of towns and commerce, spurred by increased stability and the gradual recovery from war's destruction. The emergence of guilds and trade networks fostered economic resilience, while monarchs imposed taxes and laws to regulate markets, contributing to state formation. England, meanwhile, was embroiled in the Wars of the Roses, a dynastic conflict between the houses of Lancaster and York that further weakened the nobility and devastated the countryside. The struggle for the throne disrupted trade and daily life, leading to social unrest and shifts in allegiance that foreshadowed the eventual Tudor dynasty. The rise of the printing press in the mid-15th century, pioneered by Johannes Gutenberg, revolutionized communication and the dissemination of knowledge. Books, once rare and expensive, became more accessible, promoting literacy and new ideas that challenged traditional authority. This technological innovation played a crucial role in spreading Renaissance humanism and later, Reformation thought. Religion remained a dominant force shaping medieval life, with the Catholic Church exerting significant influence over politics, culture, and education. However, dissatisfaction with clerical corruption and the lavish lifestyles of some church officials sowed seeds of reform. Movements like the Lollards in England and the Hussites in Bohemia criticized church practices and advocated for a return to scriptural primacy, foreshadowing the upheavals of the 16th century. Meanwhile, the rise of the Ottoman Empire posed a new threat to Christian Europe. The capture of Constantinople in 1453 by Sultan Mehmed II marked the end of the Byzantine Empire and shifted the balance of power. The Ottomans expanded into southeastern Europe, prompting responses from European states that ranged from diplomatic alliances to military campaigns, including the formation of crusading orders. Culturally, the late medieval period was rich and complex. The flourishing of Gothic architecture gave way to early Renaissance styles, blending religious tradition with renewed interest in classical antiquity. Universities expanded, preserving and advancing knowledge in theology, philosophy, and the sciences. Meanwhile, chivalric ideals continued to shape the nobility's self-image, even as warfare and politics demanded pragmatic adaptation. This era laid the groundwork for the transition from medieval to early modern Europe, a world on the cusp of profound transformation. As the 15th century advanced, the social fabric of Europe underwent profound changes that altered the daily lives of peasants, artisans, and nobles alike. The Black Death, which had ravaged the continent a century earlier, had drastically reduced the population, leading to a labor shortage that shifted economic power toward the working classes. Serfs and peasants found increased bargaining power for better wages and living conditions, weakening the rigid feudal system that had defined medieval society. This demographic shift encouraged migration to towns and cities, fueling urban growth and the rise of a more diverse middle class. Trade flourished along the burgeoning routes connecting Europe to Asia and Africa, with Italian city-states like Venice and Genoa dominating Mediterranean commerce. These cities became hubs of wealth and culture, attracting artists, merchants, and thinkers who contributed to the Renaissance's intellectual awakening. Technological advancements such as improved shipbuilding and navigation instruments enabled explorers to venture farther than ever before. Portugal, under Prince Henry the Navigator's patronage, pioneered maritime exploration along the African coast, laying the foundation for the Age of Discovery. These voyages not only expanded European horizons but also initiated complex interactions with distant peoples, setting the stage for global empires and cultural exchanges. In the realm of warfare, the introduction of gunpowder weapons transformed military tactics and castle design. Fortifications evolved from towering stone walls to angled bastions designed to withstand cannon fire. Armies became more professional, incorporating infantry armed with firearms alongside traditional cavalry. These changes diminished the military dominance of the knightly class and empowered monarchs who could afford to equip and maintain standing forces. Politically, the consolidation of kingdoms continued with marriage alliances and dynastic claims reshaping borders. The unification of Spain through the marriage of Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile in 1469 was a pivotal moment, leading to the completion of the Reconquista and the eventual sponsorship of Columbus's voyages. This union set a precedent for centralized authority and imperial ambition that would influence European history for centuries. Religious life remained central but increasingly contested. The Renaissance papacy, while lavish and politically engaged, faced criticism for corruption and nepotism. Calls for reform grew louder, laying the groundwork for figures like Martin Luther in the next century. Mysticism and new religious orders emerged, emphasizing personal piety and devotion, signaling a shift in spiritual expression. Education and the arts blossomed, supported by wealthy patrons eager to display their status and power. The late medieval period witnessed dramatic transformations in European society, culture, and politics that would shape the future in profound ways. The Hundred Years' War between England and France, which had spanned much of the 14th and 15th centuries, finally drew to a close in 1453 with the French reclaiming most of their territories, thanks in part to new military technologies like the longbow and early cannon. This conflict, though devastating, stimulated the rise of national identities, fostering a sense of unity and pride among common people and nobility alike. The war also strained feudal armies and accelerated the decline of the knightly class, replaced increasingly by professional soldiers and mercenaries. In England, internal strife culminated in the Wars of the Roses, a dynastic struggle that would end with the rise of the Tudor dynasty. Across the continent, the invention of the printing press by Johannes Gutenberg around 1440 revolutionized the dissemination of information. Books became more accessible, literacy slowly increased, and ideas spread rapidly, challenging traditional authorities in religion and governance. This technological leap helped fuel the Renaissance and later the Reformation by empowering individuals to engage directly with texts. Economically, the late medieval period saw the continued growth of towns and the merchant class, which began to exert influence in political affairs. Guilds regulated trades and protected members' interests, while banking families like the Medicis of Florence accumulated enormous wealth and patronized the arts. The rise of capitalism's early forms intertwined with expanding trade networks reaching into Asia and the Americas. Socially, the Black Death's aftermath still echoed, but populations gradually recovered. This growth intensified competition for land and resources, leading to tensions and periodic peasant revolts, such as the English Peasants' Revolt of 1381. These uprisings challenged the established social order and hinted at the coming shifts toward more centralized state power. The church remained a dominant institution, but cracks were appearing. Calls for reform echoed across Europe as corruption and political entanglements eroded papal prestige. Monastic orders reformed, and lay movements sought personal spirituality outside clerical mediation. These religious currents sowed the seeds for the seismic changes of the 16th century. Meanwhile, art, architecture, and philosophy flourished as the ideals of humanism took root. The renewed interest in classical antiquity inspired monumental works and new intellectual pursuits that blended faith with reason and creativity. Universities expanded their curricula, training a new generation of thinkers who would question and transform medieval worldviews. In summary, the 15th century was a pivotal era marked by conflict, innovation, and cultural rebirth. It saw the gradual dismantling of medieval structures and the emergence of modern nation-states, laying the groundwork for exploration, colonization, and religious reform. The legacy of this time continues to influence the trajectory of Western civilization to this day. The late medieval period's political landscape continued to shift as powerful monarchies solidified their control, edging toward the early modern era. In France, King Louis VI's reign was marked by efforts to centralize authority and reduce the influence of rebellious nobles, laying the groundwork for a more unified kingdom. His diplomatic cunning and strategic marriages extended French territories and diminished feudal fragmentation. England, under Henry VII, emerged from civil war and established the Tudor dynasty, focusing on restoring royal authority and stabilizing the economy after decades of turmoil. The Iberian Peninsula witnessed the decisive completion of the Reconquista in 1492, as the Catholic monarchs Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile captured Granada, the last Muslim stronghold in Spain. This victory not only united Spain under Christian rule but also allowed the monarchy to direct attention and resources toward overseas exploration. That same year, Christopher Columbus's voyage, sponsored by Ferdinand and Isabella, opened the gates to the Americas, fundamentally altering global history. Meanwhile, the Holy Roman Empire remained a patchwork of semi-autonomous states, though emperors sought to exert influence over its vast territories, often contending with powerful princes and city-states. The political complexity of the empire reflected the enduring legacy of feudalism amidst emerging centralized powers. Economically, trade flourished as new routes to the east were sought and the discovery of the New World promised unprecedented wealth. Italian city-states such as Venice and Genoa thrived as commercial hubs, their fleets dominating Mediterranean commerce. The influx of gold and silver from the Americas would later cause inflation but also stimulate economic growth in Europe. Social structures began to shift further as a burgeoning middle class gained prominence, challenging traditional aristocratic privileges. The cultural flourishing of the Renaissance continued, with artists like Leonardo da Vinci and Michelangelo pushing the boundaries of art, science, and engineering. Their works exemplified the era's fusion of scientific inquiry and artistic expression. Education expanded with humanist scholars promoting classical learning and critical thinking. Religious life, however, remained tense. The Catholic Church, although powerful, faced mounting criticism for corruption and excess. Calls for reform intensified, culminating in the early 16th century with figures like Martin Luther challenging church doctrines, an upheaval that would fracture Christendom. In sum, the late 15th century was a time of profound transition. Monarchs consolidated power, exploration redefined horizons, and cultural achievements reshaped thought. The medieval world was giving way to new realities, setting the stage for the transformative centuries ahead. The dawn of the 16th century saw the final years of the medieval era blend into the dawn of modernity, as European powers continued to evolve politically, economically, and culturally. The consolidation of nation-states became a dominant trend, with monarchs strengthening their control through more efficient administrations, professional armies, and centralized taxation systems. France under Francis I exemplified this shift, fostering a strong monarchy that patronized Renaissance arts and pursued territorial expansion. England, following the Wars of the Roses, solidified the Tudor dynasty's rule, balancing diplomacy with military power to maintain stability. Meanwhile, the Holy Roman Empire struggled with internal divisions but remained a central player in European politics. Religious tensions simmered as the Catholic Church confronted growing calls for reform, which would soon erupt into the Protestant Reformation, altering Europe's spiritual and political landscape. The Reformation challenged the Church's authority, leading to conflicts that would dominate much of the century. Overseas, the spirit of exploration sparked by Columbus's voyages led to increased expeditions, colonization, and the beginning of global trade networks. Spain and Portugal spearheaded these efforts, establishing vast empires in the Americas, Africa, and Asia. The influx of precious metals and new commodities reshaped European economies and societies, fueling both wealth and conflict. Cultural achievements continued to flourish as Renaissance humanism spread northward, influencing education, science, and the arts. Innovations in printing allowed ideas to disseminate rapidly, shaping public opinion and intellectual discourse. Meanwhile, technological advancements in warfare and navigation transformed military and exploratory capabilities. Socially, the rigid feudal hierarchies of the medieval period gradually gave way to more complex class structures, with emerging bourgeoisie gaining influence in cities and courts. Despite these changes, many medieval institutions and traditions persisted, creating a complex tapestry of continuity and change. The early 16th century was thus a pivotal moment, where medieval legacies met new forces of change, setting Europe on a path toward profound transformation that would define the modern age. As the 16th century progressed, the tension between tradition and innovation intensified, creating a dynamic and often volatile European landscape. The Protestant Reformation, initiated by Martin Luther's 95 Theses in 1517, spread rapidly across the continent, fracturing the religious unity that had defined medieval Christendom. This schism ignited wars, political alliances, and social upheavals as rulers and populations chose sides between Catholicism and emerging Protestant sects such as Lutheranism, Calvinism, and Anglicanism. The Catholic Church responded with the Counter-Reformation, a concerted effort to reform internal corruption, reaffirm doctrine, and reclaim lost territories. The Council of Trent, convened between 1545 and 1563, played a crucial role in revitalizing Catholicism, emphasizing education, discipline, and missionary work. This period saw the rise of new religious orders like the Jesuits, who became instrumental in spreading Catholicism worldwide. Politically, Europe was marked by fierce rivalries and shifting alliances, with major powers such as Spain, France, and the Holy Roman Empire vying for dominance. The Habsburg dynasty, ruling both Spain and the Empire, sought to maintain Catholic hegemony through strategic marriages, warfare, and diplomacy. Meanwhile, England's break with Rome under Henry VIII led to the establishment of the Church of England, further complicating the religious and political map. These religious conflicts were often intertwined with struggles for power, territory, and influence, affecting everyday lives and shaping national identities. The era also witnessed significant cultural and intellectual developments. The Renaissance, fueled by humanist ideals, encouraged critical inquiry, artistic expression, and scientific exploration. Figures like Copernicus challenged long-held geocentric views, while artists such as Michelangelo and Raphael created works that blended religious themes with human emotion and classical beauty. The invention and spread of the printing press facilitated the rapid dissemination of ideas, enabling both reformers and counter-reformers to reach wider audiences. Overseas, European powers expanded their global reach through exploration, colonization, and trade. The Spanish conquest of the Aztec and Inca empires brought vast wealth but also devastating consequences for indigenous populations. The Atlantic slave trade began to take shape, underpinning the emerging global economy. Despite the turmoil, this period laid foundational changes that would eventually lead to the Enlightenment and the modern nation-state system. The latter part of the 16th century was marked by intensified conflicts and profound transformations throughout Europe. The religious wars that had simmered since the Reformation erupted into open battles, particularly in France, the Holy Roman Empire, and the Netherlands. The French Wars of Religion, spanning from 1562 to 1598, were a brutal struggle between Catholics and Huguenots, the French Protestants. These conflicts devastated the French countryside and saw atrocities such as the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre in 1572, when thousands of Huguenots were slaughtered in Paris and across the country. Eventually, the Edict of Nantes in 1598 granted limited religious freedoms to the Huguenots, attempting to restore peace but leaving tensions unresolved. Meanwhile, the Holy Roman Empire became the epicenter of religious and political strife. The empire was a patchwork of semi-autonomous states and principalities, many of which had adopted Protestantism. The Peace of Augsburg in 1555 had allowed rulers to choose their state's religion, but it failed to resolve deeper conflicts. These tensions contributed to the outbreak of the 30 Years' War in 1618, a devastating conflict that would engulf much of Europe in the early 17th century. In the Netherlands, the struggle for independence from Spanish rule began in the 1560s and culminated in the 80 Years' War. Protestant Dutch provinces resisted the Catholic Spanish crown's attempts to enforce religious conformity and political control. The conflict gave rise to the Dutch Republic, a significant maritime and economic power. The rise of powerful monarchies also shaped this era. Queen Elizabeth I of England, ruling from 1558 to 1603, skillfully navigated religious divisions, fostering a Protestant England while maintaining relative internal stability. Her reign saw the flourishing of English literature and exploration, with figures like Shakespeare and Sir Francis Drake rising to prominence. At the same time, Spain reached the height of its imperial power under King Philip II. The Spanish Armada's attempted invasion of England in 1588 ended in defeat, marking a turning point in naval dominance. Culturally, the late Renaissance and early Baroque periods brought dramatic new art and architecture styles that reflected both religious fervor and monarchic grandeur. In sum, the late 16th century was a time of violent upheaval but also remarkable cultural and political developments that shaped the trajectory of European history. The close of the 16th century saw the continuation of significant religious, political, and social shifts that would define the early modern era. The tensions from the Reformation persisted, fueling conflicts and leading to increased state centralization across Europe. In France, the fragile peace granted by the Edict of Nantes was frequently challenged, and the religious divide continued to shape French politics and society. The Huguenots maintained strongholds and influence but faced ongoing persecution and pressure to convert. In England, the transition from Elizabeth I to James I in 1603 marked a shift in monarchy, with James uniting the crowns of England and Scotland. His reign introduced new challenges in managing religious factions, particularly tensions with Catholics and Puritans, which would later erupt into civil war. Meanwhile, the Holy Roman Empire's internal divisions deepened, and the stage was set for the protracted and devastating 30 Years' War that began in 1618. This conflict would involve much of Europe and have profound demographic and economic consequences, reshaping political boundaries and alliances. The Dutch Republic continued to consolidate its independence, establishing itself as a major commercial and naval power with a thriving culture of art, science, and commerce. Globally, European exploration and colonization accelerated, with Spain, Portugal, England, and the Netherlands expanding their overseas empires in the Americas, Africa, and Asia. These ventures brought wealth but also new conflicts and the beginning of a global system of trade and empire. Culturally, the late Renaissance transitioned into the Baroque, influencing art, music, and literature with dramatic, emotional styles that reflected the era's turbulence and grandeur. The closing decades of the 16th century thus set the foundation for a century marked by war, exploration, and cultural flourishing, all emerging from the complex legacies of the medieval and Renaissance worlds. The early 17th century in Europe was dominated by the build-up and eruption of the 30 Years' War, a conflict that arose from a volatile mix of religious, political, and territorial disputes within the fragmented Holy Roman Empire. The Peace of Augsburg in 1555, which had attempted to ease tensions by allowing rulers to choose the religion of their territories, failed to provide lasting stability. Protestant and Catholic factions clashed repeatedly, and the rise of militant Calvinism further complicated the religious landscape. The immediate catalyst was the defenestration of Prague in 1618, where Protestant nobles threw Catholic officials out of a castle window, igniting open rebellion against Habsburg authority. This act triggered a series of wars that engulfed much of Central Europe, drawing in external powers such as Sweden, France, and Spain, each pursuing their own agendas. The conflict devastated populations through battles, sieges, famine, and disease, with some regions losing up to a third of their inhabitants. It also reshaped the political map of Europe, weakening the Holy Roman Emperor's authority and elevating the power of territorial princes and emerging nation-states. The Peace of Westphalia in 1648 finally ended the war, establishing principles of state sovereignty and non-interference that became the foundation of the modern international system. Beyond the battlefield, the war accelerated changes in military tactics and technology, including the professionalization of armies and the increasing importance of artillery and fortifications. The social impact was profound, with widespread displacement, economic hardship, and shifts in population distribution. Culturally, the war inspired artistic and literary reflections on suffering and faith, while also spurring intellectual debates that would contribute to the Enlightenment. The 30 Years' War thus marked both an end and a beginning, a tragic climax to religious conflict in Europe and a transformative step toward the modern state system. The aftermath of the 30 Years' War left much of Central Europe in ruins, with cities reduced to rubble and vast swaths of farmland devastated by years of continuous fighting. The social fabric had been torn apart, entire communities were displaced, and many survivors faced famine, disease, and economic collapse. The war also altered the balance of power, significantly weakening the once dominant Habsburg dynasty. The emperor's control over the Holy Roman Empire was diminished as territorial princes gained greater autonomy, marking a shift from a fragmented empire toward more centralized nation-states. France emerged as a dominant European power, capitalizing on the decline of Habsburg Spain and Austria. The Swedish military interventions introduced new methods of warfare and demonstrated the importance of well-trained, professional armies over mercenary forces. These changes influenced military strategies for decades to come. Politically, the Peace of Westphalia established key principles, including the recognition of state sovereignty and the right of rulers to determine their own religious policies without outside interference. This agreement laid the groundwork for modern diplomacy and the concept of the nation-state. Economically, the war's devastation prompted shifts in trade routes and agricultural practices, accelerating recovery efforts that varied widely across regions. Culturally, the trauma of the war influenced art, literature, and philosophy, with themes of suffering, faith, and human endurance becoming prominent. The conflict's religious dimension also faded over time, replaced by more secular and pragmatic approaches to governance and international relations. In many ways, the 30 Years' War acted as a crucible for modern Europe, reshaping its political landscape, social structures, and cultural identity. It underscored the dangers of religious fanaticism and political fragmentation while highlighting the necessity for diplomacy and balance of power. This legacy continued to influence European history, politics, and conflicts well into the modern era. As the 17th century progressed, the social and economic landscape of Europe continued to evolve in the wake of the 30 Years' War. The war had left an indelible mark on the population, especially in the German states, where depopulation due to battle, famine, and disease was severe. Recovery was slow, and the rebuilding of towns and infrastructure was a daunting task. The war's end also coincided with the gradual rise of absolutism, a form of governance where monarchs centralized power and sought to reduce the influence of nobility and representative bodies. In France, King Louis XIV became the embodiment of absolute monarchy, famously declaring "État, c'est moi, I am the state." His reign saw the consolidation of royal power, expansion of the French state, and a culture that glorified the monarchy. Louis' policies were influenced by the desire to avoid the religious and territorial conflicts that had plagued Europe. Elsewhere, the Dutch Republic experienced a golden age, marked by flourishing trade, science, and art. The mercantile class gained influence, and cities like Amsterdam became hubs of international commerce. The rise of capitalism and early modern financial institutions began to change the structure of European economies. The shifting balance of power also led to new alliances and conflicts. The rivalry between France and the Habsburgs continued to shape continental politics. In Eastern Europe, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth struggled with internal divisions and external threats from the expanding Russian Empire and the Ottoman Turks. Meanwhile, the Ottoman Empire was at its territorial peak but would soon face challenges from European powers seeking to curtail its influence. Religion, while less often the cause of outright war, remained a potent force in society and politics. The Catholic Counter-Reformation revitalized the Church and influenced art, education, and culture. Protestantism diversified into numerous denominations, shaping identities and alliances. Scientific discoveries during this period began to challenge traditional worldviews, setting the stage for the Enlightenment. Figures such as Galileo Galilei and Johannes Kepler advanced knowledge of astronomy and physics, undermining old cosmologies rooted in religious doctrine. The changes in thought, governance, and society during the late 17th century formed a bridge between the medieval and modern worlds. The aftermath of the 30 Years' War was thus not just about destruction and loss but about transformation, politically, socially, and intellectually. This period laid foundational elements for the nation-states, secular governance, and scientific inquiry that would define Europe's future. The dawn of the 18th century ushered in an era marked by the continued rise of powerful centralized states and the shifting dynamics of European politics. Monarchs like Peter the Great of Russia embarked on ambitious projects to modernize their realms by adopting Western technologies and administrative reforms. Peter's extensive travels through Europe inspired him to build a new capital, St. Petersburg, a symbol of Russia's new European orientation and naval ambitions. Elsewhere, The War of the Spanish Succession, 1701 to 1714, embroiled much of Europe, a conflict triggered by the death of the childless Charles II of Spain. European powers feared the unification of the French and Spanish crowns under the Bourbon dynasty would upset the balance of power. The resulting conflict involved complex alliances and battles across the continent and the Americas, ultimately leading to the Treaty of Utrecht, which redistributed territories and checked French expansion. This period also saw the Enlightenment begin to take shape, with thinkers like Voltaire, Locke, and Montesquieu questioning traditional authority, advocating for reason, and laying the groundwork for modern political and social ideas. Scientific advances continued with Isaac Newton's laws of motion and universal gravitation, which provided a new framework for understanding the natural world. The interplay between emerging secular philosophies and entrenched religious institutions created tensions but also fostered debate and innovation. Economically, the growth of colonial empires and the transatlantic trade brought wealth and resources to European powers but also intensified exploitation and conflict, particularly involving indigenous peoples and enslaved Africans. The early 18th century was thus a time of both consolidation and contest, where old medieval structures gave way to new political orders, and where the seeds of modernity were sown amid ongoing struggles for power, faith, and knowledge. The early 18th century also witnessed significant developments in art and culture, reflecting broader shifts in society and politics. The Baroque style, characterized by dramatic expression, grandeur, and movement, dominated European architecture, music, and painting. Composers like Johann Sebastian Bach and George Friedrich Handel produced works that remain cornerstones of classical music, blending religious themes with intricate musical structures that mirrored the era's complexity. Meanwhile, literature and philosophy flourished as salons and coffeehouses became centers of intellectual exchange. The rise of the novel as a literary form reflected changing tastes and the growing importance of individual experience and emotional depth. In parallel, the scientific revolution's impact extended into practical applications such as improved navigation and military technology, which fueled the expansionist policies of European powers. The age of exploration, initially driven by curiosity and trade, increasingly took on political and imperial significance as nations vied for control of strategic ports and territories around the globe. These global interactions facilitated cultural exchanges but also led to violent confrontations and the displacement of indigenous populations. Within societies, social hierarchies remained rigid, but the Enlightenment's emphasis on reason and individual rights gradually eroded unquestioned obedience to monarchy and church. Economic theories such as mercantilism dominated, promoting state control over trade and colonies, yet early capitalist practices began to emerge, setting the stage for future economic transformations. Education expanded, though largely limited to elites, sowing the seeds for more widespread literacy and intellectual engagement in subsequent centuries. The early 1700s thus represent a bridge between medieval legacies and the modern world, a period of transformation where art, science, politics, and philosophy intertwine to reshape human understanding and societal structures. Good night. Hope you enjoyed The Sleepy Scribe. Until we meet again. Welcome to The Sleepy Scribe. Your endless internet wandering has brought you here, and hopefully you can finally sleep to today's topic. Now before we begin, comment where you are listening from and how late it is where you are at. It is very interesting to see how far and wide people come. Also, please subscribe, it would be very appreciated. Let us begin. In the spring of 1769, on the Mediterranean island of Corsica, a child was born who would one day redraw the map of Europe, shake the monarchies of the old world to their foundations, and come closer than almost any man in history to global dominance. His name was Napoleon di Bonaparte, born just months after France had wrested control of the island from the Republic of Genoa. That accident of timing, being born a Corsican subject of the French crown, would shape everything that followed. Napoleon's family was minor nobility with Italian roots, but they were hardly wealthy or powerful. His father, Carlo Bonaparte, was a lawyer and political opportunist who quickly pledged loyalty to France, earning a small pension and the chance to send his children to mainland French schools. For Napoleon, this meant exile from his Corsican identity at a young age, attending military school in Brienne-le-Château. There, surrounded by the sons of the French aristocracy, Napoleon was mocked for his accent, his humble background, and his fierce Corsican nationalism. It bred in him a sense of inferiority, but also a drive to dominate. He immersed himself in books, reading Caesar's commentaries, Plutarch's Lives, and the campaigns of Alexander the Great. His love for military theory and history was rivaled only by his resentment toward the French elite. In 1784, he gained entry into the École Militaire in Paris, becoming the first Corsican to do so. He trained as an artillery officer, a branch known for its reliance on logic, calculation, and precision, skills Napoleon mastered early. He graduated in 1 year instead of 2 after his father's sudden death forced the family into financial hardship. Commissioned as a second lieutenant at 16, he entered a French army still firmly controlled by aristocrats and governed by hierarchy. There were few signs at the time that he would rise above this stagnant officer corps. But history would soon tilt in his favor. When the French Revolution exploded in 1789, everything changed. The monarchy crumbled, and the old social order disintegrated. Nobles fled or were executed, and the revolutionary government needed loyal, competent men to fill the vacuum. For ambitious officers like Napoleon, it was the opportunity of a lifetime. He supported the Jacobins, aligning himself with radical revolutionaries like Robespierre. Though he remained largely unknown, his political connections and dedication to the revolutionary cause helped him avoid the worst purges. In 1793, Napoleon was assigned to the siege of Toulon, a strategic Mediterranean port city held by Royalists and British forces. At just 24, he proposed a bold artillery plan that led to the city's recapture. His success earned him a promotion to brigadier general and caught the attention of powerful men in Paris. Toulon was his first taste of real glory and blood. The aftermath saw brutal repression, and Napoleon did not flinch. He understood that ambition in revolutionary France came at a cost. He returned to Paris a marked man, young, brilliant, and ruthlessly effective. But the political landscape was volatile. After the fall of Robespierre in 1794, Napoleon was arrested due to his Jacobin ties, narrowly escaping execution. It was his first brush with the chaos of revolutionary politics, but also a lesson in survival. Released after a few weeks, he was assigned minor duties in the army. Still, he kept himself ready. The moment to rise again would come soon, and when it did, he would seize it with both hands. After narrowly escaping death during the chaotic aftermath of the Terror, Napoleon's star began its rapid ascent. His success at Toulon had brought him to the attention of the revolutionary government's military leaders, but the political instability meant opportunities came and went quickly. In 1795, Paris was gripped by an insurrection of royalist forces aiming to overthrow the fragile revolutionary government, the Directory. The capital teetered on the edge of civil war. When the royalists marched on the Tuileries Palace in October, it was Napoleon who held the line. Commanding a small force of artillerymen, he deployed what would become his signature tactic, whiff of grape shot, a devastating burst of canister shot fired into the crowds. His quick and brutal response crushed the uprising, securing the Directory's survival. This moment proved decisive. Napoleon was hailed as the savior of the Republic and promoted to Major General. It also marked the birth of his legend as a decisive and ruthless leader willing to use force to maintain order. From this point forward, Napoleon's political and military fortunes would be tightly linked. His relationship with the Directory was complex. He was both a tool and a threat. The new government needed generals to defend the revolution, but they feared Napoleon's ambition. Still, he was given command of the Army of the Interior and later the Army of Italy. The Italian campaign, beginning in 1796, was where Napoleon truly proved himself. Facing a coalition of Austrian, Piedmontese, and Sardinian forces, he displayed remarkable strategic creativity and boldness. His forces were often outnumbered and poorly supplied, yet he consistently outmaneuvered his enemies, winning victory after victory. His rapid marches, surprise attacks, and skillful use of artillery shattered the traditional slow-moving warfare of the 18th century. One of his key tactics was dividing and conquering. He would strike isolated enemy units swiftly before they could regroup. The campaign's highlights included the stunning victory at the Battle of Lodi, where Napoleon personally led an assault across a narrow bridge under heavy fire, and the decisive Battle of Arcalay, which solidified his reputation for courage and daring. Beyond battlefield success, Napoleon used propaganda masterfully. He sent detailed bulletins to Paris newspapers, portraying himself as the embodiment of the revolutionary spirit and a protector of France. His charisma and political savvy helped him build a loyal following among both soldiers and civilians. By the end of the Italian campaign, Napoleon had transformed from a relatively obscure artillery officer into a national hero, feared and admired across Europe. Yet even as his fame grew, the political situation in France remained unstable. The Directory was weak and deeply unpopular, struggling to balance the demands of revolutionaries, monarchists, and foreign enemies. This created a volatile environment ripe for a power grab. Napoleon, aware of the fragility around him, began to consider his own ambitions, not just as a general, but as a political leader who could control the fate of France and perhaps the world. By 1798, Napoleon's reputation as a brilliant military commander was firmly established, but he sought greater glory and a path to political power. The opportunity came with the plan to invade Egypt, then a province of the weakening Ottoman Empire and a strategic gateway to British interests in India. The French Directory, eager to distract Napoleon from the turbulent politics in Paris and hoping to strike a blow against Britain's global dominance, approved the expedition. In May 1798, Napoleon set sail with a fleet of over 300 ships and nearly 40,000 soldiers, embarking on a campaign that would combine military conquest, scientific discovery, and propaganda on an unprecedented scale. The invasion began with the swift capture of Alexandria, followed by the decisive Battle of the Pyramids near Cairo, where Napoleon's use of modern tactics overwhelmed the poorly trained Mamluk cavalry. Yet, despite these victories, the campaign was fraught with challenges. The British Royal Navy, under Admiral Horatio Nelson, dealt a devastating blow to the French fleet at the Battle of the Nile, cutting off Napoleon's supply lines and trapping his army in a hostile land thousands of miles from home. Isolated and vulnerable, Napoleon adapted by positioning himself not only as a military leader but as a reformer and protector of Egyptian culture. He brought with him a team of scientists and scholars who catalogued Egypt's antiquities, including the discovery of the Rosetta Stone, which would later unlock the secrets of ancient hieroglyphs. This blend of conquest and culture helped him cultivate an image as a civilizing force, even as his army struggled with disease, local resistance, and supply shortages. Meanwhile, back in France, political chaos worsened. The Directory faltered amid economic crisis, corruption, and unrest. Napoleon, sensing the opportunity, began plotting his return. In 1799, he secretly slipped away from Egypt, leaving his army behind, and returned to France to seize power. His return set the stage for one of the most dramatic coups in history. With the help of loyal allies, Napoleon engineered the coup of 18 Brumaire, overthrowing the Directory and establishing the consulate, with himself as first consul, effectively the ruler of France. This move marked the end of the revolution and the beginning of Napoleon's personal rule. The Egyptian campaign, despite its setbacks, had elevated his profile and provided him with the political capital to launch this new phase. His vision extended beyond France's borders. Napoleon saw himself not just as a military genius but as the architect of a new European order, one that would spread revolutionary ideals but also cement his dominance. The world was on the brink of a transformation unlike any before, and Napoleon was at its center, poised to reshape nations, governments, and history itself. With the establishment of the consulate in 1799, Napoleon began consolidating power with remarkable speed and efficiency. The revolutionary chaos that had engulfed France for a decade gave way to a new order centered on his authority. His first years in power were focused on stabilizing the nation's economy, reforming its legal system, and rebuilding its military strength, all essential to preparing for the larger ambitions he held. One of Napoleon's earliest and most enduring legacies was the creation of the Napoleonic Code, a comprehensive set of civil laws that abolished feudal privileges, standardized property rights, and codified legal equality for men. This legal framework spread across Europe with his conquests, reshaping societies and influencing modern law codes worldwide. Politically, Napoleon was a master of symbolism and propaganda. He portrayed himself as the heir to the revolution's ideals, order, liberty, and national pride, while simultaneously dismantling many of its democratic institutions. He established a centralized bureaucracy staffed by loyal officials and used censorship and secret police to suppress dissent. By 1802, he had been named first consul for life, a move ratified by a public referendum. This gradual accumulation of power paved the way for his crowning achievement in 1804, declaring himself Emperor of the French. The coronation ceremony in Notre Dame Cathedral was a spectacle designed to convey both divine sanction and personal authority. In a calculated gesture, Napoleon crowned himself rather than allowing the Pope to do so, signaling that his legitimacy came from no higher power but himself. Meanwhile, his military campaigns continued unabated. His victories against Austria, Prussia, and other coalitions forged an empire that dominated continental Europe. Through a combination of battlefield prowess, strategic marriages, and the establishment of satellite kingdoms ruled by his relatives, Napoleon extended his influence from Spain to Poland. Yet his reign was far from uncontested. Britain remained the stubborn enemy across the Channel, using its naval supremacy to blockade French ports and support resistance movements throughout Europe. Within France, pockets of royalist and republican opposition persisted. Napoleon's vision of a European empire would demand constant warfare and political maneuvering, setting the stage for conflicts that would define his rule and eventually his downfall. The foundation of Napoleon's empire was now laid, but the challenges ahead, both at home and abroad, were immense. The story of how a Corsican boy became the master of Europe was only just beginning. By 1805, Napoleon's empire faced its greatest test yet. The fragile peace that had followed his coronation was shattered when Britain, Austria, Russia, and Sweden formed the Third Coalition against France, determined to curb Napoleon's growing dominance. Britain's naval power remained unchallenged, and it sought to isolate France economically through blockades while supporting its continental allies militarily. Austria and Russia prepared to confront French forces on land. Napoleon, ever the strategist, moved quickly to meet the threat. His army was battle-hardened and highly disciplined, organized into corps that could operate independently yet support each other. The campaign began with a swift march through Germany, catching Austrian forces off guard. The French defeated Austria decisively at the Battle of Ulm in October 1805, forcing the surrender of an entire Austrian army without heavy fighting. This stunning victory cleared the way for Napoleon to face the combined Austro-Russian forces gathering in Moravia. The decisive moment came on December 2, 1805, at the Battle of Austerlitz, often called Napoleon's greatest victory. Outnumbered yet confident, Napoleon lured the Allies into attacking what seemed a weak French right flank, only to unleash a devastating counterattack that split the enemy forces. The battlefield was engulfed in fog, which Napoleon used to conceal troop movements and deceive the Allies. The result was a crushing defeat for Austria and Russia, with thousands of casualties and prisoners. The victory shattered the Third Coalition, forcing Austria to sue for peace and weakening Russia's influence in Europe. It also solidified Napoleon's reputation as a military genius and unstoppable conqueror. The Treaty of Pressburg followed soon after, expanding French territory and influence, while the Holy Roman Empire, long a central pillar of European power, was dissolved. Napoleon's control over Central Europe grew, but the war was far from over. Britain, refusing to negotiate, continued its naval blockade and funding of anti-French coalitions. The stage was set for new conflicts, as Napoleon's ambitions and Europe's resistance collided in a series of battles and political struggles that would shape the continent's future. Following his stunning victory at Austerlitz, Napoleon sought to consolidate his power not just through military conquest but by reshaping Europe's economy to France's advantage. In 1806, he launched the Continental System, an ambitious blockade designed to cut Britain off from trade with the European mainland. Napoleon understood that Britain's strength lay primarily in its navy and its global trade network. If he could choke off Britain's commerce, he believed the island nation would collapse economically, forcing it to sue for peace. The Continental System forbade all European nations under French influence from trading with Britain, aiming to isolate the British economy. Napoleon's marshals and allies were charged with enforcing the blockade along the vast European coastline. However, the plan faced immediate challenges. Smuggling became rampant, and Britain's powerful navy still controlled the seas, enabling trade with colonies and other global partners. Some European nations resented the blockade, as it hurt their own economies and disrupted traditional trading patterns. Russia, initially an ally, grew increasingly frustrated with the economic strain caused by the system. Meanwhile, Napoleon continued his military campaigns to enforce and expand his influence. He dissolved the Holy Roman Empire in 1806, creating the Confederation of the Rhine, a coalition of German states loyal to France. This move antagonized Prussia, which felt its influence waning and prepared for conflict. The stage was set for renewed warfare. The continental system revealed both Napoleon's strategic vision and its limits. While it showcased his ability to wage economic war, it also exposed cracks in his empire's unity. The blockade strained relations with allies, sowed resentment among subject states, and failed to deliver the decisive blow to Britain Napoleon hoped for. In the coming years, these economic tensions would contribute to the unraveling of his empire, as resistance mounted both on and off the battlefield. By 1806, tensions across Europe escalated as Prussia, alarmed by Napoleon's reorganization of German territories and growing power, joined with Russia, Britain, and other allies to form the Fourth Coalition. Prussia felt particularly threatened by the Confederation of the Rhine, which Napoleon had created from the former Holy Roman Empire states, seeing it as a direct challenge to its influence in Central Europe. In October 1806, the conflict erupted into open warfare. Napoleon once again demonstrated his tactical genius during the twin battles of Jena and Austerlitz. Despite being outnumbered, French forces swiftly defeated the Prussian armies, crushing their military power in a matter of days. The victory allowed Napoleon to occupy Berlin and effectively neutralize Prussia as a military threat for the time being. However, the war was far from over. Russian forces continued to resist, and Napoleon's Grande Army pressed eastward, pursuing the retreating enemy. The harsh winter and vast distances of Eastern Europe presented significant logistical challenges for the French army. The campaign revealed the limits of Napoleon's power when operating far from home territory. His forces faced supply shortages, fatigue, and guerrilla attacks. Despite these difficulties, the French remained dominant on the battlefield, forcing the Russians to retreat further east. The War of the Fourth Coalition highlighted both Napoleon's strengths as a commander and the growing difficulties in sustaining a sprawling empire through continuous warfare. The conflict further destabilized Europe and set the stage for the vast confrontations that would culminate in Napoleon's invasion of Russia in 1812. Throughout these campaigns, Napoleon's vision of a unified Europe under French control remained steadfast, but cracks were beginning to appear in his empire's foundation. In 1808, Napoleon's empire faced a new and unexpected challenge on the Iberian Peninsula. Seeking to enforce the continental system and secure his dominance over Europe, Napoleon installed his brother, Joseph Bonaparte, as King of Spain after forcing the abdication of the Spanish Bourbon monarchy. This move ignited widespread rebellion among the Spanish people, sparking what would become the Peninsular War, a brutal and protracted conflict that would drain French resources and morale. Unlike traditional battles fought between standing armies, the Peninsular War was characterized by fierce guerrilla warfare. Spanish fighters, known as guerrilleros, used their knowledge of the rugged terrain to launch hit-and-run attacks on French forces, supply lines, and communication networks. The term guerrilla itself, meaning little war, originated during this conflict. The Spanish resistance was bolstered by British intervention under the command of Sir Arthur Wellesley, later the Duke of Wellington. British troops landed in Portugal and allied with Spanish and Portuguese forces to challenge French occupation. The combination of local insurgency and foreign military pressure created a quagmire for Napoleon's armies, which struggled to maintain control over the region. The Peninsular War became a costly drain on French manpower and finances, sapping the strength of Napoleon's forces that were already stretched thin by campaigns elsewhere in Europe. Morale among French troops declined as they faced constant ambushes, harsh weather, and an unforgiving landscape. Politically, the conflict undermined Napoleon's image of invincibility and exposed vulnerabilities in his imperial strategy. The war also had lasting effects on Spain and Portugal, weakening their colonial empires and contributing to independence movements in Latin America. Ultimately, the Peninsular War marked the beginning of a slow but steady erosion of Napoleon's dominance, demonstrating that even a powerful emperor could be challenged by determined resistance and the complexities of unconventional warfare. By 1812, tensions between Napoleon and Tsar Alexander I of Russia had escalated dramatically. The Russian emperor, frustrated by the economic strain caused by the continental system and wary of Napoleon's expanding influence in Eastern Europe, withdrew from the blockade against Britain. This breach of Napoleon's grand strategy was intolerable. Determined to enforce his will and reassert dominance over Europe, Napoleon assembled the largest army Europe had ever seen, the Grande Army, numbering over 600,000 men from across his empire and allied states. In June 1812, Napoleon launched the invasion of Russia, a bold and risky campaign aimed at forcing Tsar Alexander back into compliance. The initial advance was rapid, with French forces pushing deep into Russian territory. However, the Russians employed scorched earth tactics, burning crops, villages, and cities as they retreated, denying the French army the supplies it desperately needed. The harsh Russian summer soon gave way to a brutal autumn, and the Grande Army found itself stretched thin over vast distances, struggling with supply shortages and deteriorating morale. The pivotal moment came at the Battle of Borodino in September, a bloody and inconclusive clash that left tens of thousands dead but failed to deliver a decisive victory. The French marched on Moscow, only to find the city abandoned and set aflame by its own residents. The loss of shelter and supplies forced Napoleon into a disastrous retreat during the onset of the Russian winter. As freezing temperatures, starvation, and constant harassment by Russian forces took their toll, the Grande Army was decimated. By the time the remnants crossed back over the Niemen River, only a fraction of the original force remained. The invasion of Russia marked a turning point in Napoleon's fortunes. It shattered the myth of his invincibility and emboldened his enemies across Europe to unite against him. The campaign's failure exposed the limits of military power in the face of geography, climate, and determined resistance, setting the stage for the coalitions that would eventually topple the emperor. The catastrophic failure of the Russian campaign in 1812 sent shockwaves throughout Europe. Napoleon's enemies, sensing his vulnerability, quickly formed the Sixth Coalition, an alliance that included Britain, Russia, Prussia, Austria, Sweden, and several German states. Determined to finally end Napoleon's reign, the coalition launched a coordinated offensive against the weakened French Empire. In 1813, the decisive conflict unfolded in what became known as the War of the Sixth Coalition. After regrouping his shattered forces, Napoleon won several battles, including the notable Battle of Dresden, showcasing his enduring tactical brilliance. However, his resources were stretched thin, and the coalition's numerical superiority and growing unity began to take their toll. The pivotal confrontation came at the Battle of Leipzig, the Battle of Nations, in October 1813. This massive engagement involved over 600,000 soldiers from multiple nations, making it one of the largest battles in European history. Napoleon's forces were overwhelmed and decisively defeated, forcing a retreat back into France. The coalition's advance was relentless. In early 1814, Allied armies invaded French territory, marching toward Paris itself. Despite desperate resistance and several valiant battles, including the Battle of Paris, the French capital fell in March 1814. With his empire collapsing around him and support eroding, Napoleon was forced to abdicate the throne in April 1814. He was exiled to the island of Elba, off the coast of Italy, granted sovereignty over the small territory but stripped of his imperial ambitions. Though his reign as emperor had ended, Napoleon's story was far from over. His abdication marked a temporary pause in his quest for domination, setting the stage for one of history's most dramatic comebacks, the 100 Days. Napoleon's exile to Elba was meant to be the final chapter of his tumultuous career, but the man who once ruled Europe was far from finished. Despite the island's small size and limited resources, Napoleon quickly established control over Elba's administration and military. However, he never lost sight of his ultimate goal, to reclaim power in France. News of the restored Bourbon monarchy under King Louis XVIII and widespread dissatisfaction with the ruling regime's weakness and corruption reached Napoleon. Sensing an opportunity, Napoleon secretly planned his escape. In February 1815, he slipped past the British naval blockade and landed on the French mainland with a small band of loyal followers. His return sparked a wave of enthusiasm among the French people, soldiers, and officers still loyal to the ideals of the revolution and the glory of the empire. As Napoleon marched toward Paris, royalist forces sent to arrest him instead defected to his side. Within weeks, the Bourbons fled, and Napoleon reclaimed the throne in what became known as the 100 Days. During this brief period, Napoleon sought to rebuild his army and restore his influence across Europe. He implemented reforms to stabilize the economy and bolster military readiness, aware that the European powers would not tolerate his return for long. The other monarchies quickly formed the Seventh Coalition, determined to crush Napoleon's resurgence once and for all. The stage was set for a final confrontation that would decide the fate of the French Empire and Napoleon's legacy. The climax of Napoleon's return to power culminated in the Battle of Waterloo on June 18, 1815, a confrontation that would become one of the most famous battles in history. Facing him was the combined army of the Seventh Coalition, including British forces under the Duke of Wellington and Prussian troops commanded by Field Marshal Gebhard Lebrecht von Blücher. Napoleon, though commanding a smaller force than in previous campaigns, was determined to strike a decisive blow that would secure his reign once more. The battle unfolded on the muddy fields near the town of Waterloo in present-day Belgium. Napoleon's initial strategy focused on breaking Wellington's lines through frontal assaults and intense artillery bombardments. However, Wellington's forces held firm, bolstered by strong defensive positions and timely reinforcements. Throughout the day, fierce fighting raged, with the French army making several costly but ultimately unsuccessful attacks on Allied positions. The arrival of Blücher's Prussian forces late in the afternoon proved to be the turning point. Their intervention split Napoleon's army, forcing a retreat and eventually a rout. The defeat at Waterloo shattered Napoleon's final bid for power. He fled the battlefield and abdicated once again, surrendering to the British shortly afterward. This defeat marked the definitive end of his rule and the Napoleonic Wars, bringing an era of European upheaval to a close. Napoleon was exiled to the remote island of St. Helena in the South Atlantic, where he would spend the remainder of his life. The Battle of Waterloo became a symbol of the limits of military ambition and the resilience of the Allied powers united against him. Though his empire had crumbled, Napoleon's impact on Europe and the world would endure long after his fall. Though Napoleon's military conquests ended with his exile, his influence on European society, law, and governance continued to shape the continent for generations. One of his most enduring contributions was the Napoleonic Code, officially the Code Civil, enacted in 1804. This legal code simplified and unified French laws, replacing the patchwork of feudal and royal statutes that had long governed the country. The Napoleonic Code emphasized clear rules regarding property, contracts, and civil rights, while abolishing privileges based on birth. It established principles like equality before the law, secular authority, and protection of private property. The code's influence extended far beyond France, spreading to much of continental Europe through conquest, treaties, and the establishment of client states. Countries from Italy to the Netherlands, Germany to Poland, adopted legal systems inspired by or directly derived from Napoleon's reforms. The code also laid the groundwork for modern civil law traditions worldwide. Beyond law, Napoleon's reforms modernized administration and education. He centralized the French government, creating efficient bureaucracies staffed by trained civil servants. His support for the lycée system standardized education, training a new generation of professionals and military officers loyal to the state. These changes helped dismantle the old aristocratic order and fostered meritocracy based on talent and achievement rather than lineage. Napoleon's legacy is also visible in the political map of Europe. His reshaping of borders, creation of satellite kingdoms, and weakening of old empires sowed the seeds for nationalist movements that would dominate the 19th century. While he sought to impose French dominance, he inadvertently inspired desires for self-rule and identity among conquered peoples. His career remains a complex mixture of revolutionary ideals and authoritarian rule, military genius and ruthless ambition. Napoleon Bonaparte's life was a defining chapter in the transition from the Ancien regime to the modern world, leaving a legacy that continues to provoke debate and fascination. Napoleon's reshaping of Europe not only redrew political borders but also profoundly influenced the rise of nationalism across the continent. By installing family members and loyalists on thrones and reorganizing territories, he disrupted centuries-old identities and allegiances. In places like Germany and Italy, which were fragmented into numerous small states, Napoleon's conquests helped awaken a sense of national unity among people who shared language, culture, and history but lacked political cohesion. The Confederation of the Rhine, a coalition of German states under French influence, dissolved the Holy Roman Empire and planted the seeds for German nationalism. Similarly, in Italy, the spread of Napoleonic reforms and administrative unification sparked early movements toward Italian unification. However, Napoleon's empire also sparked fierce resistance. The Peninsular War in Spain was fueled by fierce Spanish nationalism and a determination to resist foreign rule. Across Europe, popular uprisings and guerrilla warfare challenged French occupation. These conflicts forged a new political consciousness centered on national identity and self-determination, themes that would dominate the 19th and 20th centuries. After Napoleon's fall, the Congress of Vienna in 1815 sought to restore the old monarchies and balance of power but could not erase the nationalist currents unleashed by his rule. The map of Europe would continue to evolve, driven by revolutions, wars, and diplomatic shifts inspired in part by the legacy of Napoleonic rule. In this way, Napoleon's ambition to control Europe paradoxically helped catalyze forces that ultimately undermined imperial domination, ushering in an era defined by the struggle for nationhood and democracy. Napoleon's impact on warfare extended far beyond his own campaigns. His innovations in strategy, tactics, and army organization revolutionized the way wars were fought and influenced military thinking for generations. Central to his success was the concept of the corps system, which divided his army into self-sufficient units capable of independent action but also able to rapidly concentrate for battle. This flexibility allowed for faster maneuvers and better exploitation of enemy weaknesses. Napoleon also emphasized speed and surprise, often marching his troops faster and farther than traditional armies, allowing him to strike before his enemies could prepare. His use of massed artillery, coordinated infantry and cavalry assaults, and emphasis on morale and leadership changed the battlefield dynamic. He inspired his troops through personal example and charismatic leadership, creating loyalty and fighting spirit. His campaigns showcased the importance of logistics and supply, and the challenges of maintaining large armies over long distances and varied terrain. Although his tactics were eventually countered, many principles he developed remain foundational in modern military doctrine. Moreover, Napoleon's wars spurred developments in military medicine, engineering, and administration, as armies adapted to the demands of sustained, large-scale conflict. The legacy of his military genius is seen in the successes and failures of armies well into the 20th century, as generals studied his campaigns for lessons on maneuver, strategy, and leadership. While often celebrated for his military prowess, Napoleon was also a skilled diplomat who understood the importance of alliances, treaties, and political marriages in maintaining and expanding his empire. His diplomatic efforts aimed to isolate Britain and keep European powers divided, preventing a united front against France. Through a complex web of alliances and client states, Napoleon extended French influence far beyond the battlefield. He married twice, first to Josephine de Beauharnais, whose social connections helped him rise in Parisian society, and later to Marie-Louise of Austria, cementing a crucial alliance with the Habsburgs. Napoleon's diplomacy was not limited to Europe. His ambitions stretched toward the Middle East and the Americas, as evidenced by his Egyptian campaign and attempts to sell the vast Louisiana territory to the United States in 1803, a move that raised funds for his wars and reshaped global geopolitics. Despite his efforts, Napoleon's diplomatic strategies faced limits. The aggressive expansion of French power alarmed other nations, leading to repeated coalitions against him. The fragile balance of power in Europe was repeatedly upset, culminating in widespread warfare. Napoleon's diplomatic legacy includes both the spread of revolutionary ideals and the realpolitik of empire building, demonstrating the complex interplay between force and negotiation in shaping history. Napoleon was a master of image-making and propaganda, understanding that controlling how he was perceived was as crucial as winning battles. He cultivated a cult of personality that presented him as a heroic, almost mythic figure, a leader destined to bring order and glory to France and Europe. Through carefully crafted portraits, statues, and public ceremonies, Napoleon projected power and legitimacy. Artists like Jacques-Louis David immortalized him in paintings that emphasized his strength, wisdom, and connection to both revolutionary ideals and imperial authority. Newspapers and pamphlets circulated stories of his military genius and benevolent leadership, reinforcing his image among the French populace and soldiers alike. Napoleon also used symbols and rituals, such as his self-coronation and the Legion of Honor, to foster loyalty and national pride. His control over censorship and secret police helped suppress dissent and maintain a unified narrative. This propaganda machine was vital in maintaining support during difficult campaigns and political upheavals. The cult of personality created around Napoleon set a precedent for future leaders who sought to blend political power with charismatic authority, demonstrating the power of image in modern statecraft. Central to Napoleon's vision of empire was the establishment of a ruling dynasty that would secure his legacy and extend his influence across Europe. Unlike the old Bourbon monarchy he had overthrown, Napoleon sought to create a new imperial family rooted in merit, loyalty, and conquest. He crowned himself emperor in 1804 and later installed his brothers and sisters as rulers of client kingdoms. Joseph Bonaparte became king of Naples and then Spain, Louis Bonaparte ruled Holland, Jerome Bonaparte took control of Westphalia. This strategy allowed Napoleon to maintain tight control over vast territories while promoting his family's status. However, this dynastic approach was a double-edged sword. Some siblings proved ineffective or unpopular, leading to unrest and resistance in their realms. The imposition of French-style rule and reforms clashed with local traditions, fueling nationalist backlash. Napoleon's heir, his son Napoleon II, was briefly recognized as emperor after his abdication but never ruled, symbolizing the fragile nature of his dynastic ambitions. Despite these challenges, the Bonaparte dynasty marked a significant shift in European monarchy, emphasizing meritocratic ideals blended with familial loyalty. It reflected Napoleon's desire not just for military conquest but for lasting political order, even as his empire's fate became increasingly precarious. Though often overshadowed by his military and political exploits, the women in Napoleon's life played crucial roles in shaping his personal and public persona. His first wife, Josephine de Beauharnais, was a key figure in his rise. A widow with connections to the French aristocracy, Josephine's charm and social skills helped Napoleon navigate the complex political landscape of revolutionary and Napoleonic France. Their marriage was passionate but fraught with difficulties, including Josephine's inability to provide an heir, which ultimately led to their divorce in 1810. Despite this, she remained a loyal supporter and close confidant until her death. Napoleon's second marriage to Marie-Louise of Austria was as much a political alliance as a personal union, designed to secure ties with the Habsburg monarchy. Beyond his wives, women in Napoleon's court and family wielded influence through patronage, diplomacy, and cultural activities. Their roles illustrated the intersection of gender, power, and politics during this transformative era. Napoleon's attitudes toward women were complex. He admired strong, intelligent women yet upheld traditional views on their roles in society. Understanding these dynamics offers a fuller picture of the man behind the emperor and the social fabric of his empire. Napoleon's reign profoundly influenced European art, culture, and architecture, shaping the aesthetic and symbolic landscape of the early 19th century. He was a patron of the arts who understood their power to legitimize his rule and glorify his achievements. Under his direction, neoclassicism became the dominant artistic style, drawing inspiration from the grandeur of ancient Rome and Greece, which Napoleon admired and sought to emulate. Architects designed monumental buildings and public works that celebrated the empire, such as the Arc de Triomphe in Paris, commissioned to honor the victories of the French armies. Sculptors and painters created works depicting heroic scenes from Napoleon's campaigns, reinforcing the myth of the emperor as a military genius and enlightened ruler. Napoleon also supported the expansion of museums, including the Louvre, which became repositories for art seized during his conquests, showcasing France's cultural dominance. The period saw an explosion of literature and music that reflected the ideals of the time, blending romanticism with themes of heroism, nationalism, and the individual. Through these cultural projects, Napoleon crafted a legacy that extended beyond politics and war, influencing European identity and artistic expression for decades. Napoleon's relationship with the Catholic Church was complex and strategically managed. The French Revolution had deeply fractured church-state relations, with revolutionary policies severely restricting the Church's power and influence. Recognizing the importance of religion in stabilizing France and legitimizing his regime, Napoleon negotiated the Concordat of 1801 with Pope Pius VII. This agreement restored much of the Church's civil status while ensuring that the Church remained subordinate to the state. The Concordat allowed the government to appoint bishops and regulated church property, striking a delicate balance between religious authority and state control. While Napoleon portrayed himself as a protector of the faith, he was careful to prevent the Church from regaining political power that might challenge his authority. His coronation in 1804 was deliberately orchestrated to emphasize his independence from the Pope, as he crowned himself rather than allowing the Pope to place the crown on his head. However, tensions persisted, especially when the Pope opposed some of Napoleon's policies, leading to moments of conflict and even the Pope's brief imprisonment. Napoleon's religious policies reflected his pragmatic approach to power, using religion as a tool for unity and control, while maintaining supremacy over all institutions within his empire. Despite his many successes, Napoleon's empire eventually crumbled due to a combination of military overreach, political miscalculations, and growing opposition from both within and outside France. The disastrous Russian campaign in 1812 severely weakened his army, leading to losses that he could never fully replace. The failure of the continental system alienated many European allies, who suffered economically and began to resist French control. Napoleon's relentless warfare exhausted France's resources and eroded popular support. His attempts to impose French rule and reforms on diverse cultures and nations often sparked nationalist uprisings and guerrilla warfare, further draining his forces. The coalition of European powers united by a common goal to end his dominance gradually gained strength, culminating in the decisive defeat at Waterloo in 1815. Napoleon's abdication and exile marked the end of an era but also reshaped the political landscape of Europe. The Congress of Vienna sought to restore balance and prevent future widespread conflict by redrawing borders and establishing a system of collective security. The fall of Napoleon also influenced emerging nationalist and liberal movements, setting the stage for revolutions and the modern nation-state. His legacy is a testament to both the potential and limits of individual ambition in shaping history. Napoleon's military career remains one of the most studied in history, with generals and strategists analyzing his campaigns for lessons in leadership, strategy, and tactics. His emphasis on speed, decisive action, and flexible command structures revolutionized military operations. The use of the corps system allowed his army to operate in dispersed formations, increasing mobility while maintaining the ability to concentrate force rapidly. Napoleon's personal leadership style, inspiring loyalty and courage in his troops, became a model for military commanders. He also demonstrated the importance of logistics and intelligence in sustaining campaigns, although his Russian invasion exposed the vulnerabilities of overextension. His successes and failures continue to be examined in military academies worldwide, influencing doctrines from the 19th century through modern warfare. Napoleon's legacy in military science underscores the enduring relevance of innovation, adaptability, and psychological warfare. Napoleon's rule left an indelible mark on the cultural landscape of France and Europe. Beyond military conquests and political reforms, he promoted arts, sciences, and education as tools of state power and national identity. His patronage encouraged the flourishing of neoclassical art, which emphasized grandeur, order, and the heroic ideals Napoleon embodied. The establishment of institutions like the Institut de France and support for scholars and scientists reflected his Enlightenment influences. Under Napoleon, the French educational system was reorganized, with the founding of the lycées, which trained a new elite of administrators and military officers. Literature and theatre during this era often celebrated themes of heroism, sacrifice, and patriotism, reinforcing the ideals of the empire. Napoleon's cultural policies helped forge a sense of unity and pride among the French people, while also spreading French language and customs across Europe. His legacy in culture illustrates how power can be expressed and maintained through intellectual and artistic means, shaping national consciousness long after political change. Napoleon's era was marked by significant advancements in science and technology, many of which were spurred by the needs of his military campaigns and administrative reforms. He understood the importance of scientific progress in strengthening the state and its army. The Egyptian expedition notably included a team of scholars and scientists who documented the region's geography, history, and culture, leading to groundbreaking discoveries such as the Rosetta Stone, which unlocked the understanding of Egyptian hieroglyphs. Napoleon established institutions that promoted scientific research and innovation, such as the École Polytechnique, which trained engineers and military officers with advanced technical skills. His armies benefited from improvements in artillery, engineering, and logistics, which allowed for more effective warfare and infrastructure development. The period also saw advancements in medicine, including battlefield surgery and sanitation, which reduced casualties and improved soldier health. These scientific achievements contributed to the modernization of France and had lasting impacts on European development. Napoleon's support for science demonstrates the interplay between military ambition and intellectual progress during one of Europe's most dynamic periods. Napoleon's reign was marked not only by military conquest but also by significant economic reforms aimed at stabilizing and strengthening France's economy. Recognizing that a strong economy was crucial for sustaining his vast military campaigns, Napoleon implemented policies to improve taxation, banking, and industry. He established the Bank of France in 1800, which helped stabilize the currency and regulate credit, fostering economic growth. Napoleon encouraged infrastructure projects such as roads, bridges, and canals to facilitate trade and troop movements. His legal reforms, including the Napoleonic Code, also protected property rights, encouraging investment and commerce. However, the continental system, designed to weaken Britain economically through a trade blockade, had mixed results. While it disrupted British trade, it also hurt French allies and occupied territories, leading to economic hardship and resentment. Additionally, ongoing wars strained the treasury and caused inflation. Napoleon's economic policies reflected a balance between modernizing the state's finances and the challenges of financing nearly continuous warfare. The legacy of these reforms influenced French economic institutions long after his fall. One of Napoleon's most enduring legacies lies in his comprehensive overhaul of the French legal and administrative systems. The cornerstone of these reforms was the Napoleonic Code, which unified and clarified laws throughout France, replacing the confusing patchwork of feudal and revolutionary laws. It established principles such as equality before the law, secular authority, protection of property, and civil liberties for men. The code became a model for many other countries' legal systems, influencing the development of civil law worldwide. Administratively, Napoleon centralized government authority, creating a highly organized bureaucracy staffed by capable officials selected on merit rather than birth. Prefects were appointed to govern regions, ensuring loyalty and efficient implementation of policies. The reforms streamlined tax collection, judicial proceedings, and public education, strengthening state control and promoting social order. Though authoritarian in nature, Napoleon's reforms modernized France's institutions and laid the groundwork for the modern French state. These changes balanced revolutionary ideals with the need for stability and effective governance, reflecting Napoleon's pragmatic approach to power. Napoleon's impact extended far beyond Europe, influencing independence movements and nationalist struggles across the globe. His military campaigns disrupted the colonial empires of Spain and Portugal, weakening their grip on territories in Latin America. The chaos and power vacuum created by his conquests inspired revolutionary leaders like Simon Bolivar, José de San Martín, and others to pursue independence from European colonial powers. The ideals of liberty, equality, and nationalism that Napoleon both championed and imposed provided a framework for these movements. In the Caribbean, the Haitian Revolution, though predating Napoleon's rise, was further shaped by the broader revolutionary spirit sweeping the Atlantic world. Napoleon's sale of the Louisiana Territory to the United States in 1803 also had long-term effects on the expansion and development of a young nation. His legacy influenced nationalist aspirations in regions as diverse as the Middle East and Asia, where ideas of sovereignty and self-rule took root. By disrupting the old order, Napoleon inadvertently helped accelerate the decline of colonial empires and the rise of modern nation-states worldwide. After his final defeat at Waterloo in 1815, Napoleon was exiled by the British to the remote island of St. Helena in the South Atlantic, over 1,000 miles from the African coast. The island's isolation and harsh climate ensured that escape was virtually impossible. Napoleon spent his last years in relative solitude, under constant British guard, reflecting on his life, writing memoirs, and engaging with a small group of loyal followers. His health gradually declined, plagued by stomach ailments and possibly cancer. Despite his fall from power, Napoleon remained a figure of immense fascination and controversy. During his exile, he cultivated an image of himself as a martyr to Europe's monarchies and a man misunderstood by history. On May 5, 1821, Napoleon died on St. Helena, marking the end of one of the most dramatic and influential lives in history. His body was later returned to France in 1840, where he was entombed with great ceremony at Les Invalides in Paris. Napoleon's death did not diminish his legacy. Rather, it cemented his place as a symbol of ambition, genius, and the complex interplay of revolution and empire. Napoleon Bonaparte's life and legacy have fascinated historians, artists, and the public for over 2 centuries. His story is one of extraordinary rise and dramatic fall, combining elements of revolutionary heroism and imperial ambition. The myth of Napoleon has been shaped by countless biographies, novels, films, and artworks, each interpreting him through different lenses, sometimes as a tyrant, sometimes as a champion of progress and meritocracy. His impact on law, military strategy, politics, and culture continues to resonate worldwide. Monuments, museums, and annual commemorations honor his achievements and controversies alike. Napoleon's name remains synonymous with leadership, genius, and the complexities of power. The memory of his nearly world-spanning empire serves as a reminder of the forces of change unleashed by revolution and the enduring human desire for greatness. His legacy invites ongoing debate about the costs and consequences of ambition, the nature of leadership, and the shaping of modern Europe. Napoleon Bonaparte's journey began in an unlikely place for someone destined to nearly rule Europe, the rocky island of Corsica. Born on August 15, 1769, Napoleon was the second of 8 surviving children in a family of minor Italian nobility. Corsica itself was newly French territory, having been sold to France by the Republic of Genoa only months before his birth. The island's fiercely independent culture and recent political upheaval colored young Napoleon's worldview. His family was not wealthy but managed to secure him a place at a French military academy. At the age of 9, Napoleon was sent to mainland France to attend a series of military schools, first in Autun and later at the prestigious École Militaire in Paris. His early years were difficult. As a Corsican, he was often treated as an outsider and had to work harder to prove himself. Nonetheless, Napoleon excelled in mathematics and artillery studies, disciplines that would become central to his military success. The French Revolution, beginning in 1789, transformed France into a land of both chaos and opportunity. The old aristocratic order was being swept away, and young men of talent, regardless of birth, found chances to rise quickly through military ranks. Napoleon embraced the revolutionary ideals, though he remained cautious in his political allegiances, understanding the risks of rapid factional shifts. His first notable military achievement came during the Siege of Toulon in 1793, where he distinguished himself by organizing the artillery that helped retake the port from royalist forces supported by the British. This success earned him promotion to brigadier general at just 24. Napoleon's subsequent campaigns in Italy between 1796 and 1797 marked his ascent to prominence. Commanding the French army of Italy, he led a series of brilliant maneuvers that defeated larger Austrian forces and their allies, securing French dominance in northern Italy. His strategy combined rapid marches, surprise attacks, and the decisive use of artillery. These victories made him a national hero in France and demonstrated his tactical genius. Yet Napoleon's ambitions extended beyond the battlefield. Through skillful propaganda, he cultivated an image of himself as a man of destiny and a defender of the revolution's ideals, even as he increasingly centralized power. Politically, Napoleon was astute. In 1799, amid the instability of the French Directory government, he participated in the coup of 18 Brumaire, effectively ending the Directory and establishing the consulate with himself as first consul. This marked the beginning of his rule over France. He quickly consolidated power, balancing revolutionary rhetoric with authoritarian control. By 1804, he crowned himself emperor, signaling his transformation from a revolutionary general to a monarch seeking to dominate Europe. Napoleon's rise from Corsican outsider to emperor was a remarkable story of talent, ambition, and timing that reshaped the course of European history. In 1798, Napoleon launched one of his most ambitious and unconventional military campaigns, the invasion of Egypt. His goal was to disrupt British trade routes to India and expand French influence in the Mediterranean and Middle East. The campaign was not only a military endeavor but also a scientific and cultural expedition, as Napoleon brought along a team of scholars, scientists, and artists tasked with studying Egypt's ancient civilization and natural environment. The initial military phase began with a swift victory over the Mamluk forces at the Battle of the Pyramids, where Napoleon's use of artillery and infantry tactics overwhelmed the enemy. However, the campaign soon encountered serious setbacks. The British Royal Navy, under Admiral Horatio Nelson, destroyed the French fleet at the Battle of the Nile, leaving Napoleon's forces stranded and isolated. The lack of naval support made resupply and communication extremely difficult. The harsh desert conditions, diseases such as the plague, and resistance from local populations further complicated the French occupation. Despite these challenges, the campaign yielded remarkable scientific achievements. The discovery of the Rosetta Stone by French soldiers was a key breakthrough that enabled scholars to decipher ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs, opening new understanding of the civilization's history. The scholars' extensive documentation culminated in the Description de l'Egypte, an influential work on Egypt's archaeology and culture. Politically, the campaign was a mixed success. Although Napoleon failed to secure long-term control of Egypt, the expedition bolstered his reputation as a leader willing to pursue bold and global ambitions. His abrupt return to France in 1799, leaving his army behind, was controversial but allowed him to seize power during the political instability at home. The Egyptian campaign exemplified the intersection of military conquest, scientific exploration, and imperial competition that defined the Napoleonic era. It demonstrated both the reach and limits of French power and presaged the increasing importance of global strategy in European conflicts. After years of revolutionary upheaval, France was deeply divided, and religion had become a major source of tension. The revolution's anti-clerical policies had alienated many Catholics and weakened the Church's influence. When Napoleon rose to power, he recognized that stabilizing the nation required healing these divisions and securing broad support. In 1801, he negotiated the Concordat with Pope Pius VII, a pragmatic agreement that redefined the relationship between the French state and the Catholic Church. The Concordat restored much of the Church's civil status, recognizing Catholicism as the religion of the majority of French citizens, but it stopped short of making it the state religion, preserving religious freedom for Protestants, Jews, and others. Crucially, the agreement gave the government the power to nominate bishops and regulate church property, ensuring that the Church remained under state control and could not become a rival political force. This balance helped to ease religious tensions and legitimize Napoleon's rule among a largely Catholic population. Despite this cooperation, tensions persisted. Napoleon maintained strict control over the Church and occasionally clashed with the papacy, especially when the Pope opposed certain policies. The Concordat was a foundation for a new model of church-state relations in France, blending revolutionary secularism with traditional religion, and it influenced similar arrangements across Europe. It reflected Napoleon's pragmatic approach to power, using religion as a tool for unity while asserting his authority. Napoleon understood that a strong and centralized state required a well-educated, disciplined, and loyal citizenry. Following the chaos of the French Revolution, the country's educational system was fragmented and inefficient, lacking uniform standards and a clear purpose. In 1802, Napoleon introduced major reforms that laid the foundation for modern French education. Central to these reforms was the creation of the lycée system, state-run secondary schools designed to train the future administrative, military, and technical elites essential to sustaining the empire. The lycées emphasized meritocracy, discipline, and patriotism, reflecting Napoleon's belief that talent and ability should determine advancement rather than birth or social class. The curriculum combined classical studies, such as Latin, Greek, and literature, with modern subjects like mathematics, science, and physical education. These schools prepared students for careers as officers, civil servants, engineers, and professionals who would uphold the ideals and needs of the Napoleonic state. Admission was based largely on merit, though access was still limited compared to modern standards, ensuring the system cultivated a loyal, capable elite. Beyond secondary education, Napoleon also restructured higher education and technical institutions like the École Polytechnique, founded earlier during the Revolution but greatly expanded under his rule. These reforms professionalized the military and civil service by providing systematic training and promoting scientific and engineering expertise crucial for warfare and infrastructure projects. The lycée system and educational reforms helped to unify the diverse regions of France under a common national identity and fostered a spirit of service and loyalty to the empire. Their influence endures in France's education system today, marking one of Napoleon's most lasting domestic legacies. By investing in education, Napoleon not only strengthened his administration and military but also shaped the intellectual and social fabric of modern France, balancing authoritarian control with enlightened statecraft. From 1803 to 1815, Europe was engulfed in a series of conflicts known as the Napoleonic Wars, which pitted Napoleon's French Empire against multiple coalitions formed by Britain, Austria, Russia, Prussia, and other European powers determined to check his expansion. These wars reshaped the political landscape of Europe and tested the limits of Napoleon's military genius. Early on, Napoleon achieved stunning victories that cemented his reputation. At the Battle of Austerlitz in 1805, often called his greatest victory, he decisively defeated the combined Russian and Austrian forces despite being outnumbered. This victory forced the dissolution of the Holy Roman Empire and the establishment of the Confederation of the Rhine under French influence. Similarly, at the battles of Jena and Austerlitz in 1806, Napoleon crushed the Prussian army, demonstrating his superior tactics and organizational skills. His innovative use of the corps system allowed flexible and rapid troop movements, overwhelming traditional linear armies. However, his military dominance was challenged by persistent resistance and shifting alliances. The Peninsular War, starting in 1808, drained French resources as Spanish guerrillas, supported by British forces, waged a brutal and protracted insurgency. The war became a costly quagmire that undermined French control in the Iberian Peninsula. The campaign against Russia in 1812 marked a turning point. Napoleon's invasion initially succeeded but was ultimately disastrous due to harsh winter conditions, scorched earth tactics by the Russians, and supply shortages, resulting in catastrophic losses. These setbacks emboldened the Sixth Coalition of European powers, which defeated Napoleon in 1814, forcing his abdication and exile to Elba. His brief return during the 100 Days ended with a decisive defeat at Waterloo in 1815. The Napoleonic Wars fundamentally altered European diplomacy, inspiring new military doctrines and nationalist movements. The conflict underscored the volatility of coalition warfare and the challenges of sustaining a vast empire through continuous conflict. Napoleon's military campaigns remain a subject of study for their strategic innovation and their profound impact on the modern world. One of Napoleon's most ambitious strategies to weaken his greatest enemy, Britain, was the implementation of the Continental System, a large-scale economic blockade designed to cut off British trade with continental Europe. Introduced in 1806 with the Berlin Decree, the system aimed to isolate Britain economically by forbidding European nations allied with or conquered by France from trading with the British. Napoleon believed that strangling Britain's economy would force it to surrender or negotiate peace on favorable terms. The blockade represented an early form of economic warfare on an unprecedented scale. However, enforcing the Continental System proved challenging. Smuggling and clandestine trade were widespread, as British goods remained in high demand across Europe. Many of Napoleon's allies and occupied territories suffered economically, leading to widespread discontent and weakening their loyalty to France. The system disrupted traditional trade networks, causing shortages and inflation in some regions. Moreover, Britain retaliated with its own naval blockades and leveraged its global colonial empire to offset losses in Europe. The failure of the Continental System became particularly evident during the Peninsular War, where resistance in Spain and Portugal, countries hurt economically by the blockade, contributed to Napoleon's military difficulties. The economic strain also contributed to unrest in other parts of Europe, including in Russia, where Tsar Alexander I eventually abandoned the system in 1810, precipitating conflict with France. Although the Continental System did not achieve its intended goal of forcing Britain's defeat, it demonstrated Napoleon's innovative approach to total warfare, combining military, economic, and political tools. Its mixed legacy highlights the complexities of economic warfare and the limits of controlling large, diverse empires through trade restrictions. Napoleon's influence extended far beyond military conquest and political power. His legal reforms transformed not only France but also many parts of Europe and the world. The Napoleonic Code, officially the Civil Code of 1804, was a comprehensive legal framework that replaced the patchwork of feudal laws with a clear, accessible, and secular system. It established principles such as equality before the law, protection of property rights, the secular nature of the state, and individual freedoms for men, while also defining family law and contracts. The code abolished privileges based on birth and promoted meritocracy, reflecting Enlightenment ideals filtered through Napoleon's pragmatic governance. Importantly, as Napoleon expanded his empire, he implemented the code in conquered territories including Italy, the Netherlands, Belgium, parts of Germany, and beyond. Even after his defeat, many countries retained or adapted elements of the code due to its clarity and modernity. The Napoleonic Code influenced civil law traditions worldwide, from Europe to Latin America and parts of the Middle East, becoming a model for legal systems emphasizing rationality and uniformity. While it was progressive in some respects, it also reinforced patriarchal authority and limited women's rights, reflecting contemporary social norms. Napoleon's legal legacy illustrates how law can serve as a tool of state building, modernization, and imperial control, shaping societies long after his empire collapsed. Napoleon Bonaparte not only shaped Europe through his own actions but also sought to secure his legacy by placing members of his family on thrones across the continent. His strategy involved marrying political ambition with dynastic rule, a move designed to consolidate French influence and create loyal monarchies sympathetic to his interests. Napoleon crowned himself emperor in 1804, signaling the start of a new dynasty, the Bonapartes. He appointed his siblings and relatives as rulers of conquered or allied territories. His brother Joseph became king of Naples and later Spain. Louis ruled Holland. Jerome was made king of Westphalia, Eliza and Pauline were given control over smaller duchies. These appointments aimed to spread Napoleonic reforms and strengthen his political network, effectively turning Europe into a family empire. However, the effectiveness of this system varied. Some relatives lacked political skill or popular support, leading to instability and resistance, particularly in Spain where Joseph Bonaparte's rule sparked widespread revolt. This familial empire also underscored the tension between revolutionary meritocracy and traditional hereditary monarchy. While Napoleon promoted advancement based on ability within France, he relied on family ties to secure power abroad. Ultimately, the Bonaparte family's reigns were often short-lived, collapsing with Napoleon's downfall. Nevertheless, this strategy reflects Napoleon's efforts to legitimize his rule and ensure the durability of his empire through dynastic control, intertwining personal ambition with the broader European political order. Napoleon Bonaparte's military conquests and administrative reforms played a crucial role in shaping the modern concept of nationalism across Europe and beyond. Before Napoleon, loyalty was often oriented around local rulers, dynasties, or religious affiliations rather than the idea of a nation-state united by a common identity. Napoleon's expansion of French influence introduced new administrative systems, legal codes, and centralized governance to various territories, which inadvertently fostered a sense of national identity among occupied peoples. His policies spread the ideals of the French Revolution: liberty, equality, and fraternity, though often paradoxically enforced through imperial rule. Resistance against Napoleonic occupation helped spark nationalist movements in countries such as Germany, Italy, and Spain, where diverse regions and states began to see themselves as part of a larger nation. The Peninsular War in Spain and Portugal, for example, became a fight not only against French rule but for national liberation. Similarly, the German states, under French domination, developed early nationalist sentiments that would later fuel unification efforts. Napoleon's legal reforms and the Napoleonic Code also laid institutional foundations that contributed to the modern nation-state concept by promoting uniform laws and citizenship. While Napoleon's empire ultimately collapsed, the nationalist ideas that grew during his era deeply influenced 19th-century revolutions and the redrawing of Europe's political map. His legacy is complex. Both a catalyst for nationalism and a symbol of imperial ambition, Napoleon reshaped how peoples understood their identities and political aspirations. Napoleon Bonaparte is one of history's most famous figures, surrounded by myths and legends, but many interesting truths stand out. Contrary to popular belief, Napoleon was not particularly short for his time. He stood around 5 feet 6 or 7 inches tall, average height for an 18th-century Frenchman. The myth of his short stature largely came from British propaganda and confusion over measurement units. Remarkably, Napoleon became a military genius at a very young age, rising quickly after his success at the Siege of Toulon in 1793, when he was promoted to brigadier general at just 24 years old. Beyond the battlefield, Napoleon was an avid reader who carried books on history, philosophy, and literature during his campaigns, showing a deep intellectual curiosity. One of his greatest legacies is the Napoleonic Code, a comprehensive legal framework that unified French law and influenced legal systems around the world, laying the groundwork for modern civil law. On a more unusual note, some accounts suggest Napoleon suffered from ailurophobia, a fear of cats, which contrasts with his otherwise commanding presence. Napoleon married twice, first to Josephine, a passionate and often turbulent relationship, and later to Marie-Louise of Austria to secure political alliances and produce an heir. Despite his imperial grandeur, Napoleon preferred simple foods such as chicken and vegetables rather than lavish feasts. After his downfall, Napoleon experienced exile twice, first to Elba and later to the remote island of St. Helena, where he spent his final years. His name became so legendary that it was used commercially to brand products ranging from pastries to cigars, reflecting his enduring cultural influence. Finally, Napoleon was a master of propaganda, carefully shaping his public image through art, newspapers, and military bulletins, often amplifying his victories and minimizing his losses. These fun facts reveal the complexities of Napoleon's character beyond the battlefield and the empire. Welcome to the Sleepy Scribe. Your endless internet wandering has brought you here, and hopefully you can finally sleep to today's topic. Now before we begin, comment where you are listening from and how late it is where you are at. It is very interesting to see how far and wide people come. Also, please subscribe, it would be very appreciated. Let us begin. In the spring of 1584, under the authority of Queen Elizabeth I, an ambitious English courtier named Sir Walter Raleigh set his sights on the uncharted lands of the New World. Raleigh, granted a royal charter, was tasked with establishing a permanent English colony in North America. This was not merely an adventure, it was a strategic move in the ongoing struggle for dominance over the seas and continents against Spain, England's fierce Catholic rival. Establishing a foothold on the Atlantic seaboard would not only secure a vital military outpost but offer a chance to access untold wealth in resources. But more than anything, it was a race to claim territory before others could. 2 ships, the Dorothy and the Elizabeth, were dispatched on a reconnaissance mission in April 1584. Captained by Philippa Modders and Arthur Barlow, the ships crossed the Atlantic and arrived at the coast of present-day North Carolina in July. They anchored near the Outer Banks and explored the region, eventually making contact with the local Secatan and Croatoan tribes. The native peoples, led by chieftains such as Wingina, welcomed the English with cautious hospitality. The region's abundance of wildlife, fertile land, and temperate climate impressed the English explorers, who returned to England with glowing reports, and 2 Native Americans, Manteo and Juan Chis, who were brought to demonstrate goodwill and learn English ways. Raleigh, buoyed by the reports, named the region Virginia in honor of the Virgin Queen. In 1585, he organized a more ambitious expedition, a military outpost rather than a permanent settlement, led by Sir Richard Grenville and Ralph Lane. Around 600 men set sail, but storms and navigational errors thinned their ranks. Only about 107 colonists remained to settle Roanoke Island. Among them were soldiers, craftsmen, and scientists, not the families or farmers one would expect for a lasting colony. Conflict soon arose. While the English initially relied on native food sources, Lane's aggressive military tactics strained relations. Wingina, once a tentative ally, began to see the colonists as invaders. Tensions escalated into violence. In a preemptive strike, Lane and his men killed Wingina in 1586, severing trust with the local tribes. Facing dwindling supplies and hostile surroundings, Lane's colony teetered on collapse. Fate intervened with the arrival of Sir Francis Drake, returning from a raid in the Caribbean. He offered passage back to England, and Lane's colonists, disheartened and desperate, abandoned the settlement. Just days later, Grenville returned with supplies and reinforcements, only to find Roanoke deserted. Refusing to lose the claim, Grenville left a small garrison of 15 men behind before sailing home. The idea of an English colony at Roanoke might have ended there, but Raleigh was undeterred. In 1587, he authorized another attempt, this time, a civilian colony meant to be permanent. Led by John White, an artist and cartographer, this new group included men, women, and children, about 115 settlers in total. Among them was White's daughter, Eleanor Dare, and her husband Ananias. Eleanor was pregnant when they departed England. Upon arrival at Roanoke, White found the remains of the previous military settlement abandoned and decayed. The local tribes, wary after the prior violence, were no longer friendly. Rather than settling on the more promising Chesapeake Bay as originally planned, White was persuaded, perhaps by necessity or orders from the ship's captain, to remain on Roanoke Island. There, the colonists rebuilt their homes and tried to establish a life. In August 1587, Eleanor Dare gave birth to Virginia Dare, the first English child born in the New World. The event was celebrated, but the colony faced immediate challenges. The settlers quickly realized they lacked sufficient supplies. Their location was vulnerable, their relations with nearby tribes were strained, and their lifeline to England was tenuous. The colonists urged White to return to England to request more supplies. He reluctantly agreed, departing Roanoke in late 1587, intending to return swiftly. But fate, once again, had other plans. White's return was delayed not by months, but years. When he arrived back in England, the country was on the brink of war. The looming threat of the Spanish Armada consumed England's resources, and all available ships were pressed into national defense. Despite White's pleas, he could not secure a vessel to return to Roanoke. It was not until 1590, 3 years later, that he finally returned to the colony he had left behind. What he found was not devastation. It was nothing. The colony was gone. No bodies. No signs of battle or disease. The houses had been dismantled in an orderly fashion. The only clues left behind were a single word carved into a post, Croatoan, and the letters CRO etched into a nearby tree. There was no cross carved beside the message, which had been the agreed-upon distress signal if the colony had been forced to flee under duress. White believed the message indicated the colonists had moved to Croatoan Island, now known as Hatteras Island, where the friendly Croatoan tribe, led by Manteo, lived. But storms prevented White from reaching the island, and he never saw his daughter, granddaughter, or any of the colonists again. The disappearance of the Roanoke colonists would become one of the greatest mysteries in American history. Over the next centuries, countless theories would emerge: massacre, disease, integration with native tribes, Spanish attacks, or secret migration. Yet no definitive answer has ever been found. Even today, the word Croatoan lingers in the imagination, a single enigmatic clue left behind by a vanished people, their fate lost to time and legend. When John White sailed away from Roanoke in 1587, he could not have known that his departure would mark the final confirmed contact between England and the colony. His intended supply mission was supposed to be swift. Yet as he reached England's shores, he found a nation gripped by the threat of invasion. The Spanish Armada was preparing to strike, and every available English ship was conscripted to defend the homeland. White pleaded with Raleigh and other sponsors for a vessel, but none could be spared. The Crown, fearing a full-scale Spanish assault, forbade any non-military crossings of the Atlantic. White was forced to wait, helpless, as months turned into years. His frustration mounted with every passing season. He feared for his daughter, his newborn granddaughter, and the settlers left behind. Though Raleigh remained interested in the colony's fate, his attention was divided. The failure of earlier attempts had cost him prestige and resources. Though he financed a few privateering ventures with instructions to check on Roanoke, none reached the colony. Finally, in 1590, the political situation in England had stabilized enough to allow for White's return. He joined a private expedition led by John Watts and Christopher Newport aboard the Hopewell and Moonlight. But this rescue mission was not solely focused on Roanoke, it was part of a larger privateering voyage. White's return was conditional, dependent on favorable weather and the goals of the fleet's investors. The ships sailed into the Outer Banks in August, and White, eager and anxious, led a small landing party to the site of the old colony. What they found both shocked and mystified them. The settlement was abandoned, but it had not been destroyed. The houses had been dismantled methodically, not burned or torn apart. The fences and defensive earthworks had been removed. It was as if the colonists had left deliberately, taking what they could and leaving behind only silence. The only clear clue was the word Croatoan carved into a post of the fort's palisade. Nearby, the letters CRO were etched into a tree. Crucially, there was no sign of violence. No bones, no graves, no burnt structures. White interpreted the carvings as a sign that the colonists had relocated to Croatoan Island, home to a friendly native group who had aided earlier expeditions. The absence of a cross, their agreed-upon distress symbol, suggested the colonists had not been forced away. Instead, they may have left willingly, perhaps to escape starvation or threats from hostile tribes. White immediately urged the captains to sail to Croatoan Island, but a powerful storm struck the Outer Banks, damaging the Hopewell and making navigation perilous. Supplies were dwindling, and the ship's commanders, focused on their privateering objectives, refused to risk further delay. White was forced to return to England, heartbroken and without answers. He would never again sail to America. The fate of his family, and the entire Roanoke colony, remained unknown. In England, interest in Roanoke faded. Raleigh's charter was eventually revoked, and he turned his attention to new colonial ventures. But the mystery endured. Over the next decades, sporadic attempts were made to find traces of the lost colonists. Some explorers claimed to hear tales from native tribes of pale-skinned people living inland. Others reported European-style buildings or English artifacts deep in native territory. Yet none of these accounts could be verified. One of the most tantalizing early clues came from Captain John Smith of Jamestown, who, in 1607, learned from the Powhatan chief Wahunsonacore of a group of settlers who had lived among a rival tribe. According to Powhatan, he had wiped them out in a massacre. Smith never found physical proof, but the report suggested some Roanoke survivors may have lived for years before meeting a violent end. Another report, from William Strachey in 1612, described natives speaking broken English and wearing European clothing. He also referred to two-story stone houses allegedly built by survivors. These stories fueled speculation that the colonists had been absorbed into native communities, intermarrying and adapting to their new environment. But again, no conclusive evidence emerged. Complicating matters were the strained relations between Jamestown settlers and local tribes. Few trusted the English, and even fewer allowed detailed questioning. Information about Roanoke was difficult to gather, often based on hearsay or filtered through tribal politics. Meanwhile, English interest shifted toward new colonies, such as Jamestown and Plymouth. Roanoke became a ghost of history, a failed experiment overshadowed by the colonies that succeeded. But whispers of the lost colony persisted. Some believed the colonists had moved inland to the Chowan or Roanoke River. Others thought they had fled south to the Albemarle Sound or west into the mountains. Still others believed they had intermarried with tribes such as the Lumbee, who later displayed features and linguistic traits unlike their neighbors. The Lumbee, for example, have long claimed descent from the lost colonists. Early European visitors noted their lighter skin and some English-sounding surnames. A 1709 account by explorer John Lawson described natives near Hatteras Island who said their ancestors could talk in a book and wore English-style clothing. They told Lawson that their ancestors came from a shipwreck, but it's possible this was a garbled reference to Roanoke. Despite tantalizing details, no archaeological site has ever confirmed the location of the colonists after their departure. Excavations on Hatteras Island have uncovered some European items, but nothing definitively linked to the lost colony. Modern technology, including DNA testing and ground-penetrating radar, has yet to provide clarity. The trail remains cold, but the fascination endures. What began as England's first attempt at settlement in the New World ended in silence, carved in wood, and carried by wind and sea. The question remains, did they survive, adapt, and vanish into the tapestry of indigenous America, or did they meet a darker, final fate? As the 17th century unfolded, the enigma of the lost colony lingered in the minds of explorers, colonial officials, and native tribes alike. With every new settlement carved into the North American landscape, English colonists hoped to uncover some trace of their vanished predecessors. Yet for every whisper, every tale shared in broken dialects or hushed tones around council fires, hard evidence remained elusive. Jamestown, founded in 1607, became the center of English interest in Virginia, and for its early leaders, the question of what happened to the Roanoke settlers was not simply academic. Some believed they might still be alive. Others feared they had perished in a massacre. And for some, especially among the Powhatan Confederacy, the issue had a different weight entirely. According to Chief Powhatan, leader of a powerful alliance of tribes stretching across much of coastal Virginia, his warriors had attacked and destroyed a group of settlers living with a rival tribe. Powhatan told Captain John Smith and other Jamestown leaders that the colonists had joined with the Chesapeake Indians and had been killed during a campaign to eliminate regional threats. If true, this could mean that at least some Roanoke survivors had migrated away from the Outer Banks and sought protection inland. Powhatan even presented Smith with objects that allegedly belonged to the Roanoke colonists: brass kettles, a musket barrel, and other English goods. Smith was skeptical. The items could have come from trade, wrecks, or theft. But Powhatan's claims couldn't be ignored. The English were always alert to the possibility that survivors might be found, especially if they had integrated into native tribes. Yet searching for them was fraught with risk. The English were outsiders, often unwelcome in interior territories. Gathering intelligence depended on interpreters, alliances, and political dynamics they barely understood. Meanwhile, native accounts of light-skinned people living inland multiplied. In 1609, William Strachey, secretary of the Jamestown colony, wrote of tribes that housed children with gray eyes and reddish hair. He described an area called Okanahowan, where survivors were supposedly kept as servants or wives. In another letter, he claimed that Powhatan had slaughtered the survivors near the site of present-day Jamestown, fearing they would ally with the English newcomers. Yet no physical remains, no settlements, and no written records have ever been found to substantiate these claims. By the mid-1600s, the search for Roanoke survivors had turned into legend. Colonists and explorers continued to encounter tribes who spoke fragments of English or bore Anglo-European features, but explanations were never certain. Some had encountered shipwrecked sailors. Others had visited English trading posts. The possibility of integration persisted but could never be confirmed. Perhaps the most enduring theory is that the Roanoke colonists gradually assimilated into friendly native communities, particularly the Croatoans of Hatteras Island. These people, who had helped the first English expeditions, were known for their hospitality and knowledge of the land. The colonists, realizing they were alone, vulnerable, and running out of supplies, may have chosen to live among them rather than face starvation or conflict with hostile groups. Some modern historians believe that the dismantling of the colony structures, the absence of signs of violence, and the carvings left behind all support this theory. Integration would have required giving up English customs, adopting new ways of living, and perhaps even abandoning hope of ever returning to England. But it would have given them a chance to survive. Linguistic clues add to the mystery. The Lumbee tribe, who emerged in the region around the Lumber River in later centuries, have long claimed descent from both native and European ancestors. Early observers noted that the Lumbee spoke English, practiced Christianity, and used surnames such as Brooks, Lowry, and Oxendine, names also found among the Roanoke settlers. The tribe's oral history includes stories of English ancestors arriving before Jamestown, blending with local tribes, and creating a new community. Still, no definitive genealogical or archaeological evidence has verified this lineage. DNA testing has yet to conclusively link the Lumbee or other tribes to the Roanoke colonists. Another avenue of investigation lies in archaeological digs along the North Carolina coast and inland river valleys. In recent decades, archaeologists have discovered scattered European artifacts, metal tools, gun parts, pottery shards, far from the original Roanoke site. Two areas in particular, known as Site X and Site Y, have drawn attention. Site X, located near the confluence of the Chowan and Roanoke rivers, yielded Tudor-period English ceramics and other objects that match the time of the lost colony. Some scholars argue these may indicate that a small group of colonists relocated inland. Site Y, found on Hatteras Island, has produced similar artifacts. Excavations by the First Colony Foundation revealed items such as a rapier hilt, copper rings, and a slate writing tablet, objects of English origin, buried among native habitation layers. Yet the problem remains. None of these finds are definitive. English goods were widely traded among native peoples and may have arrived through indirect channels. The presence of an English object does not prove the presence of a specific colonist. Despite these limitations, the discoveries suggest that contact between English settlers and local tribes persisted beyond 1587. Whether this contact involved full integration or fleeting encounters is still debated. Adding to the mystery is the possibility of deliberate secrecy. If the colonists had fled to escape danger or lived under the protection of allies, they may have concealed their presence from later English visitors. The failure of White's rescue mission, the slow trickle of information from the frontier, and the shifting alliances between native groups all contributed to a veil of silence. As decades passed, the original colony's fate was overtaken by events. Jamestown became the new symbol of English persistence, and Roanoke a cautionary tale. Yet its mystique only grew. In the minds of the curious, the hopeful, and the obsessed, Roanoke remained a symbol of possibility, a moment when history took a turn and left no map. By the 18th century, the mystery of the lost colony had become embedded in the folklore of colonial America. It was no longer just a historical puzzle but a tale told on both sides of the Atlantic, an enduring legend of brave settlers swallowed by the wilderness. With each passing generation, the story became more mythologized. Yet beneath the legend, evidence continued to surface, albeit in fragments, keeping the debate alive. In 1701, English explorer John Lawson journeyed through the Carolinas, seeking to document the region's natural resources, geography, and people. During his travels, he visited Hatteras Island, where he encountered native inhabitants who identified themselves as descendants of both the local tribes and the English. Lawson noted their grey eyes, fair complexions, and ability to speak rudimentary English. He recorded their claim that some of their ancestors could read in a book and were descended from white settlers who had lived among them for generations. This account, written over a century after the disappearance of the Roanoke colony, reignited speculation that at least part of the group had survived and assimilated. Lawson's writings also helped solidify the belief that Croatoan Island, modern Hatteras, was the most likely refuge for the missing colonists. The clues White had found in 1590 now seemed prophetic. However, the The long lapse of time between the colony's disappearance and Lawson's visit left room for doubt. Oral history can be altered with each retelling, and Lawson's own interpretations may have colored the reports. Even so, Lawson's observations offered one of the few detailed records of early native European hybridity in the region. While some scholars dismissed the idea as romantic nationalism, others saw it as a real lead deserving further inquiry. Meanwhile, another piece of the puzzle began to surface in the Lumbee tribe. Centered in present-day Robeson County, North Carolina, the Lumbee claimed descent from both Native American groups and English settlers. Throughout the 18th and 19th centuries, visitors and colonial officials alike noted their distinct language patterns, surnames similar to those found among the Roanoke colonists, and cultural practices that blended European and native traditions. When North Carolina granted the Lumbee recognition as a Native American tribe in 1885, the legislature explicitly cited their descent from the lost colony. Later, in the mid-20th century, the Lumbee pushed for federal recognition using similar claims. Critics questioned the historical validity of these connections, pointing to the lack of genealogical or archaeological confirmation. But oral tradition remained strong, passed down within Lumbee families for centuries. Whether based in fact or adapted over time, the tribe's story kept the memory of Roanoke alive. Throughout the 19th century, Roanoke's fate fascinated amateur historians, novelists, and early archaeologists. In 1837, George Bancroft's History of the United States devoted several pages to the lost colony, framing it as a noble failure, an early spark of English colonization that would be reignited at Jamestown. Poets and authors romanticized the colony's fate, imagining tragic ends and heroic survival. Virginia Dare, the first English child born in the New World, became a symbol of purity and lost innocence. By the late 1800s, she had been mythologized into everything from a patriotic emblem to a folk heroine. Her name was used for towns, products, and political causes. A marble statue of Dare was even commissioned for display, portraying her as a grown woman, though she had vanished as an infant. Meanwhile, amateur archaeologists and relic hunters scoured the Outer Banks and inland regions for any trace of the colonists. Most finds were inconclusive. The shifting sands of the Outer Banks, combined with centuries of hurricanes, erosion, and development, complicated the search. Sites that may have once held evidence were submerged, destroyed, or relocated by natural forces. Still, occasional discoveries added intrigue. Clay tobacco pipes, glass beads, English-style pottery shards, and early iron tools were found scattered along trade routes and native settlements, some of them dating to the late 16th century. By the close of the 20th century, the search for the lost colony had shifted from the realm of folklore and speculative history into the hands of professional archaeologists, linguists, and geneticists. With each passing decade, the methods of investigation grew more precise, and the questions more complex. Could modern science finally illuminate what had happened more than 4 centuries ago? In the 1990s, the first Colony Foundation was established to support serious archaeological research into the fate of the Roanoke settlers. This organization, formed by a group of historians and field experts, focused on the original site of the colony on Roanoke Island as well as other nearby locations that had been connected to the settlers by oral tradition or early accounts. Working with careful excavation strategies and advanced dating techniques, archaeologists began uncovering European artifacts at several promising sites. In particular, a location near the town of Buxton on Hatteras Island, formerly known as Croatoan, began to yield items of interest. Among the finds were pieces of 16th-century English ceramics, iron tools, and a small slate fragment inscribed with lines that may have come from a writing tablet. These discoveries, while not abundant, were consistent with a small group of English colonists living among native peoples, using and maintaining European goods alongside indigenous tools and pottery. Yet, the evidence was ambiguous. Critics noted that European artifacts could have arrived through trade or been collected from abandoned sites. Native groups in the region had been in contact with Europeans for decades. The presence of an English tool did not necessarily prove the presence of a specific Roanoke settler. Still, the finds at Croatoan offered the most tantalizing possibility yet that some of the colonists had relocated there after 1587. Meanwhile, attention turned inland. In 2012, researchers from the British Museum re-examined an Elizabethan-era watercolor map painted by John White himself. The map, known as La Virginia Pars, depicted the region surrounding the Roanoke colony. Under ultraviolet light, scholars discovered a patch on the map, an area near the confluence of the Roanoke and Chowan rivers, where someone had used invisible ink to mark the outline of a fort or settlement. This hidden symbol prompted a renewed interest in what would come to be known as Site X. Excavations at Site X, near the town of Merry Hill in Bertie County, North Carolina, revealed a small collection of European artifacts, including a nail, a blade, and ceramics dating to the late 16th century. These items were buried alongside Native American pottery, suggesting some level of cultural exchange or cohabitation. The possibility that a portion of the Roanoke colonists moved inland to this location, either to escape danger or to seek better conditions, gained support. Site X, along with the Croatoan finds, provided a framework for what some now believe is the most plausible scenario, that the colonists split into smaller groups and relocated in different directions, some integrating with local tribes, others establishing temporary inland camps or settlements. This dispersal would explain the absence of a single mass grave, the lack of ruins at Roanoke, and the scattered nature of later English artifacts. However, these hypotheses still face challenges. No written accounts from the colonists have ever been found. No structures definitively built by English settlers in these locations have survived. Oral histories from native groups are often suggestive, but imprecise, clouded by time and translation. Even the names on early English maps have shifted or vanished, making identification difficult. Some historians have questioned whether the entire mystery has been overstated. In their view, the disappearance of the Roanoke colonists, while dramatic, may simply reflect the expected failure of an ill-supplied, isolated outpost. Many colonies in the early modern era vanished due to disease, starvation, or conflict. What makes Roanoke different, they argue, is not its outcome but the lack of surviving witnesses. In the absence of final letters, bodies, or colonial records, the mystery was allowed to take on a mythic dimension. Yet it is this very absence that continues to drive inquiry. The possibility that some colonists survived for years, adapting and enduring, offers a powerful counter-narrative to the notion of failure. It suggests resilience rather than defeat. And it raises deeper questions about identity, migration, and cultural fusion in the early Americas. In recent years, efforts have turned toward genetic research. Some scholars have proposed using mitochondrial DNA testing to search for links between native groups in the Carolinas and the descendants of Roanoke colonists. While promising in theory, such efforts are fraught with difficulty. Many genealogical lines have been lost or intermixed over 4 centuries. Consent and tribal sovereignty also play key roles, as many native groups are understandably cautious about genetic studies with colonial implications. So far, no DNA evidence has proven a connection, but the effort continues. Beyond science, cultural memory remains one of the most enduring elements of the Roanoke mystery. On Roanoke Island, the outdoor drama The Lost Colony still plays each summer. Tourists walk the wooded paths where the settlers built their homes. Children learn the story of Virginia Dare in schoolbooks, and local museums preserve the narrative through exhibits and reenactments. Even the word Croatoan, carved so simply into a post centuries ago, has become a symbol of unanswered questions. It has appeared in novels, television shows, and films. It stands as a single, enigmatic clue, an echo from a vanished world. Each year brings new speculation. Did the colonists build a second village somewhere in the swamps? Did they reach Spanish Florida and were they captured? Did they leave behind documents now lost to time or buried beneath modern construction? Or did they, like many displaced people in history, simply fade into the cultures that welcomed them, leaving no record but memory? The story of Roanoke is not only about disappearance, it is about possibility. It invites us to imagine not only how people died, but how they might have lived, adapted, and survived. Whether the final answer lies beneath centuries of soil or within the memories of descendant communities, the lost colony remains one of the oldest and most haunting, unsolved stories in American history. As scholars pursued the story of the lost colony into the 21st century, the mystery remained rooted not only in scattered artifacts and fragmentary records but in the very landscapes that had once cradled the vanished settlers. The Carolina coast, with its shifting sands, barrier islands, tidal estuaries, and inland rivers, has proven both a cradle and a graveyard for evidence. Archaeologists today contend with a region where storms can erase centuries of history in a single night, and where erosion, flooding, and development have likely buried or swept away vital clues. Despite these obstacles, efforts to pinpoint the colony's fate intensified in the early 2000s. The First Colony Foundation continued its work on Hatteras Island, digging deeper into sites that had yielded English artifacts. Excavations at the Buxton site, near the heart of former Croatoan territory, revealed post holes, hearths, and trash pits filled with a mixture of English and native pottery fragments. Pieces of copper, iron, and glass, items unlikely to have originated from native production, were found alongside traditional shell tools and ceramics. Some of the artifacts bore marks of wear and modification, suggesting that native users had adopted and repurposed European items. This blending of material culture provided a compelling case for sustained contact, if not outright integration, between Roanoke colonists and the Croatoan people. Still, definitive proof remained elusive. Without human remains, personal inscriptions, or documented genealogies, the artifacts could only imply, not confirm. Meanwhile, attention to inland sites expanded. Site X, identified through John White's map and explored by archaeologists near the Albemarle Sound, produced further evidence of 16th-century English presence. In addition to ceramic fragments and a food storage jar, several wrought iron items and gunflints were unearthed, tools that would have been essential to colonists adapting to wilderness survival. The context of the finds, intermingled with native materials, supported the idea that the settlers had moved into the territory of the Chowanoke or other tribes and possibly established semi-permanent outposts. While the scale of the site did not suggest a full colony, it may have housed a smaller group of survivors. Some researchers now believe the Roanoke colonists divided into multiple factions, with some moving to Croatoan Island, others journeying inland, and perhaps still others attempting to reach Chesapeake Bay as originally intended. This theory, known as the dispersal hypothesis, fits the available data and explains the patchwork nature of later findings. It also mirrors patterns observed in other early colonial ventures, where adaptation and movement were essential for survival. If the Roanoke settlers indeed scattered across the coastal plain and interior, their legacy may not lie in one single village but in dozens of traces, hidden in the fabric of native communities, buried under fields, or lost in rivers long since rerouted. The dispersal hypothesis also aligns with linguistic and cultural clues that have persisted into modern times. Among the Lumbee people, oral histories continue to reference ancestors who came from the sea, lived in palisaded settlements, and spoke English long before the Jamestown colony. Early records show that many Lumbee families carried English surnames identical to those of Roanoke colonists, such as Dare, Sampson, and Taylor. By the late 19th century, the Lumbee were observed practicing forms of Christianity and agriculture more akin to European styles than their neighboring tribes. Critics of the Lumber-Roanoke connection argue that such traits could have emerged through later contact, migration, or intermarriage with other colonial groups. Nonetheless, the persistence of such claims, maintained across centuries, suggests a cultural memory too detailed to ignore. Yet despite decades of work, the fundamental truth of Roanoke's fate remains uncertain. Some researchers believe the colony was doomed almost from the start. Its arrival was poorly timed. The settlers lacked enough supplies, skilled labor, or defensive strength. Their leaders, particularly John White, left them at a critical moment. The location on Roanoke Island, exposed and removed from key trade routes, offered little long-term viability. When White failed to return promptly, the colonists were likely forced to make a series of desperate decisions. In this view, their disappearance was not so much a mystery as a quiet tragedy, lost not to conspiracy or conquest but to the merciless conditions of the New World. Others, however, resist this fatalistic narrative. They point to the careful dismantling of the original settlement, the carved messages, and the lack of evidence for violence. These colonists, they argue, were not wiped out, they adapted. They formed new alliances, blended into the land, and created new lives out of necessity. If true, then the lost colony is not a tale of failure but of transformation. Today, the land around Roanoke still bears the weight of this unsolved history. Tourists walk the preserved grounds at Fort Raleigh National Historic Site, where outlines of the original earthworks remain visible. Interpretive signs and museum displays offer theories, maps, and models. The surrounding woods, shaped by 400 years of growth, conceal whatever the storm and sand have not claimed. The outdoor symphonic drama The Lost Colony, performed each summer on the island, remains a living tradition. Its cast of locals and students brings to life the voyage, the hope, and the vanishing. Beneath the footlights, descendants of both native tribes and early settlers mingle, sometimes unaware that their family stories may intersect deeper than they know. Meanwhile, advances in remote sensing, underwater archaeology, and environmental forensics continue to offer hope. Drones scan the forests for old settlement patterns. LiDAR imaging detects subtle changes in terrain that suggest buried structures. Core samples from surrounding waters are analyzed for pollen, ash, and other traces of human activity. Each technological leap pushes the boundary of what might be found. Yet even with modern tools, Roanoke resists full disclosure. Its secrets are held in the currents of the Albemarle Sound, the roots of ancient oaks, and the collective memory of people who have lived on these lands for generations. To solve Roanoke is not just to locate a vanished camp, it is to unravel a deeper story of encounter, adaptation, and the human instinct to endure. In the broader context of colonization, the Roanoke mystery offers more than just a puzzle. It serves as a reflection of the cultural collisions, ambitions, and uncertainties that define the age of exploration. When the 115 colonists arrived in 1587, they brought with them more than tools, weapons, and hopes of a new life. They carried assumptions about dominance, civilization, and permanence. Yet the reality they encountered was far more complex, governed by existing native power structures, environmental hardships, and the unpredictable nature of transatlantic support. From the start, the colony's fate was shaped as much by its environment and timing as by its own internal choices. John White's departure was supposed to be temporary, a supply mission that would return him within months. But England's war with Spain turned that short errand into a 3-year absence, and the colony, stranded, undersupplied, and surrounded by wary or hostile neighbors, was forced to choose between waiting for a rescue that might never come or taking their fate into their own hands. Many scholars argue that this decision point was critical. The colonists, recognizing the limits of their isolation, may have broken into smaller family units and allied themselves with groups they believed would offer the best chance of survival. Some may have joined Manteo and the Croatoan people on Hatteras Island. Others, especially those familiar with inland geography from earlier expeditions, could have sought refuge with the Chowanoke or other tribes living near the Roanoke and Chowan rivers. The consistent absence of any mass grave, burned settlement, or signs of conflict at the colony site reinforces the theory that their departure was deliberate and organized. Rather than vanishing in a moment of crisis, the colonists seem to have quietly dispersed, leaving only carved messages behind. Their careful dismantling of buildings, removal of tools, and even the absence of personal items like clothing or domestic debris suggests forethought and planning. If this was abandonment, it was not done in haste. For those who may have reached Croatoan Island, life would have changed dramatically. The Croatoan people had a well-developed society adapted to the barrier islands and mainland shorelines, relying on fishing, farming, and hunting. English settlers, particularly artisans and skilled workers among the group, could have offered metalworking, carpentry, or navigation skills in exchange for food and protection. The cultural exchange would have been profound on both sides, with language, customs, and technology blending gradually over time. The implications of such an integration are vast. It would have meant the earliest example of successful cultural fusion in English colonial history, occurring decades before Jamestown and in stark contrast to later episodes defined by violence, displacement, and disease. In this light, the Roanoke colonists become not victims of disappearance but pioneers of a different kind of colonization, one that did not conquer but adapted. However, this scenario, while compelling, is challenged by a lack of direct evidence. No clear diary or letter has emerged to narrate the colonists' decisions. No structure has been unearthed that can be definitively tied to their relocation. The artifacts, while numerous, remain circumstantial. Interpretations often rely on triangulating oral traditions, material culture, and indirect signs rather than hard proof. One of the greatest challenges in solving the mystery lies in the terrain itself. The coastal ecosystems of North Carolina are dynamic and unstable. Hurricanes frequently reshape islands and riverbanks. Archaeological sites are often submerged or buried beneath centuries of sediment. In some cases, entire sections of land once visible on early maps have since vanished. What might once have been a relocated settlement or burial ground may now lie beneath brackish waters or have been washed into the sea. Modern technology offers some hope. Remote sensing techniques, including LiDAR and ground-penetrating radar, have revealed subtle patterns on the landscape that could indicate long-buried structures or pathways. Soil analysis can now detect ancient hearths or agricultural activity invisible to the naked eye. Teams equipped with underwater archaeology tools have begun surveying coastal zones for signs of shipwrecks or flooded settlements. Still, the Roanoke mystery resists a single solution. Its endurance lies not just in the absence of evidence but in the richness of competing theories. Some believe the colonists may have fled north, reaching the Chesapeake Bay and encountering the Powhatan before being exterminated. Others maintain that they perished due to disease, starvation, or exposure shortly after White's departure, their remains lost to the elements. Still others argue that the colony was destroyed by hostile tribes, and that the carvings left behind were red herrings or signs made under duress. Each theory has strengths and weaknesses, supported by select pieces of evidence or historical record. None has yet closed the case. The Spanish theory, for example, suggests that Spain, aware of England's colonial ambitions, may have destroyed the colony. Spanish patrols operated in the region, and some documents reference their awareness of the English presence. However, no Spanish record has ever confirmed such a raid, and the methodical abandonment of the colony does not align with the pattern of violent eradication. The disease theory faces similar complications. Epidemics were common in early colonial settings, and poor sanitation, unfamiliar foods, and malnutrition would have left the settlers vulnerable. But disease leaves traces: hasty burials, mass graves, abandoned possessions. These signs are absent at Roanoke. Starvation, too, seems unlikely given the colonists' proximity to fishing, farming, and potential trade with local tribes. Perhaps the most difficult theory to dismiss entirely is the idea of assimilation. Native oral histories, linguistic patterns, and even genetic studies continue to hint at a long-term English presence among some coastal and inland tribes. It would not be unusual for a small group of survivors to be adopted into local communities, particularly if they brought valuable skills or forged bonds through marriage. Over time, their identities would blur, their Englishness fading with each generation. They would no longer be colonists, they would become part of a new, hybrid culture, remembered not through documents but through bloodlines and traditions. The challenge, then, is not just historical. It is philosophical. What does it mean for a colony to vanish? Does disappearance require death and destruction, or can it also mean transformation and redefinition? In seeking the lost colony, historians are also seeking a broader truth about what it meant to settle, survive, and belong in a land already occupied. Roanoke may never yield a single, conclusive answer, but in its ambiguity lies its power. The story of Roanoke also reflects the profound challenges early English settlers faced in understanding and navigating Native American societies. Unlike later English colonies that relied heavily on trade, alliances, or outright conquest, Roanoke settlers arrived in a complex political landscape. The coastal region was home to multiple native groups with shifting alliances and rivalries, including the Croatoan, Secatan, and Algonquian-speaking tribes. These peoples had long-established trade networks, cultural traditions, and territorial claims. Early English explorers, including Thomas Harriot and John White, documented their interactions with these tribes, noting both moments of cooperation and tension. The Croatoan people, in particular, stood out as potential allies. Their willingness to assist John White's expeditions and provide food and guidance made them invaluable to the settlers. It is widely believed that the word Croatoan carved into the post at the abandoned Roanoke site was a message indicating the colonists' intention to relocate to Croatoan Island. However, the English never confirmed this because White's rescue mission was cut short. Beyond just geographic refuge, integration with native peoples would have required deep cultural adjustments. Colonists faced language barriers, differing social customs, and unfamiliar survival techniques. They would have needed to adopt indigenous methods of fishing, farming, and shelter building to endure the harsh conditions. Marriages between colonists and native individuals may have helped cement alliances and ease tensions. This possibility, while difficult to verify historically, is supported by modern understanding of cultural contact zones, where exchange and adaptation were common. The colonists' struggle at Roanoke must also be viewed in the broader context of English colonial ambition and imperial rivalry. England was a latecomer to the New World, competing with Spain, France, and Portugal for control and influence. The failure to establish a permanent foothold at Roanoke was a setback in this imperial race, but also a learning moment. Lessons from Roanoke shaped the strategies used at Jamestown and later colonies, which emphasized stronger military presence, better supply lines, and more cautious relations with native peoples. In literary and cultural terms, Roanoke has become a symbol of mystery and loss, but also of hope and resilience. The figure of Virginia Dare, the first English child born in America, has been reinterpreted over centuries, from a tragic icon to a symbol of pioneering spirit. The drama The Lost Colony and countless books, films, and documentaries have kept the story alive, inviting audiences to imagine the hopes and fears of those early settlers. Today, scholars continue to investigate with renewed vigor. Interdisciplinary approaches combining archaeology, ethnography, history, and genetics aim to unravel the complex narrative. Collaboration with native tribes ensures that oral histories and cultural sensitivities inform research. The story of Roanoke is no longer just about English settlers but about the peoples of the region as a whole, their interactions, struggles, and shared futures. Despite 4 centuries of mystery, the Lost Colony's legacy endures, not as a simple tale of disappearance but as a profound story of cultural encounter, survival, and transformation at the dawn of American history. One of the most enduring elements of the Roanoke mystery lies in the legacy left by John White himself. As both an artist and a leader, White documented the landscapes, people, and resources of the region with remarkable detail. His watercolor paintings provide some of the earliest visual records of Native Americans and the environment of the Outer Banks in the late 16th century. These images, preserved through copies and engravings, offer valuable insights into the relationships between colonists and indigenous communities. White's artistic work captures not only portraits of native leaders like Manteo and Wanchese but also scenes of daily life, fishing, agriculture, and settlement patterns. They reveal a world in flux, between established native cultures and new arrivals from across the ocean. Yet despite his artistic contributions, White's legacy is shadowed by the colony's fate. His 3-year absence, forced by England's political turmoil, has been viewed by some historians as a tragic turning point. Had he returned sooner, the colony might have been resupplied, strengthened, and saved. Others argue that the colony's challenges went beyond leadership, that environmental, social, and strategic factors would have doomed Roanoke regardless. White's carved message, Croatoan, remains one of the most haunting marks in American history. It is a rare, tangible sign of the colonists' agency, a clue left deliberately for rescuers. Yet the failure of rescue efforts and subsequent loss of communication consigns the message to eternal ambiguity. Throughout the centuries, historians and enthusiasts have debated the meaning and intent of the carving. Was it a hopeful sign pointing to refuge? A signal of surrender? Or perhaps a coded message with hidden meaning? The carved letters continue to provoke speculation. The Lost Colony also occupies a unique place in the history of colonial memory. Unlike Jamestown, Plymouth, or Quebec, Roanoke never developed into a permanent settlement or political center. It remains, instead, a ghost story of early colonization, an episode defined by silence and absence. This silence has invited storytellers, artists, and historians to fill in the gaps with conjecture, imagination, and legend. Roanoke has inspired everything from Edgar Allan Poe's eerie tales to modern mystery novels and television series. It has been portrayed as a curse, a miracle, or a warning. The site itself has become a destination for tourists, researchers, and those fascinated by unsolved history. Archaeological efforts continue, but the search for definitive proof is hampered by the passage of time, the fragility of evidence, and the complex interactions between native peoples and settlers. In recent decades, collaboration with local native tribes, including the Lumbee and the Hatteras people, has grown, emphasizing respect for indigenous perspectives and oral histories. These voices offer alternative narratives, stories of cooperation, kinship, and survival that contrast with traditional Eurocentric histories. The search for the lost colony is thus not only a quest for physical remains but a journey into the overlapping stories of culture, identity, and belonging. What happened to those settlers is still a question with no single answer. They may have dispersed, adapted, died, or been absorbed into native societies. Their fate is woven into the larger fabric of America's first encounters between Europeans and native peoples. Roanoke's legacy endures as a symbol of mystery, resilience, and the complex birth of a new world. The lost colony's enduring mystery has inspired countless archaeological expeditions, each bringing new techniques and technologies to bear on a centuries-old enigma. Beginning in the late 20th century, researchers increasingly employed interdisciplinary approaches, combining archaeology, anthropology, and environmental science, to explore Roanoke Island and surrounding regions. These efforts focused not only on uncovering artifacts but on reconstructing the broader ecosystem and social environment that the settlers encountered. One major breakthrough came from the use of underwater archaeology. The Outer Banks and surrounding waterways are infamous for shipwrecks, treacherous currents, and shifting sands. Excavations have revealed Spanish and English ships lost in these waters, some possibly related to the Roanoke expeditions. By examining these wrecks, scholars gained insight into the supplies, weapons, and trade goods that might have supported or failed the colonists. Additionally, soil analysis and pollen studies revealed evidence of early farming efforts, maize, squash, and beans, indicating that the settlers tried to establish agriculture quickly but faced climatic and soil challenges. Understanding the delicate balance of the coastal environment was crucial. Frequent storms and saltwater intrusion would have made survival difficult. Meanwhile, advances in historical linguistics helped trace possible English native contact and cultural exchange. Scholars examined early Algonquian dialects for English loanwords and analyzed native oral traditions that might preserve memories of English settlers. These linguistic clues, while subtle, provided another thread connecting disparate pieces of evidence. In tandem, DNA and genetic studies have entered the conversation, though with caution and respect for indigenous sovereignty. Some researchers have attempted to identify genetic markers among descendant native populations that might link back to English settlers. These studies are complicated by centuries of intermarriage, migration, and cultural blending, but they underscore the potential for science to supplement historical inquiry. Despite these advances, definitive answers remain elusive. The search for artifacts continues across multiple sites: Roanoke Island itself, Croatoan Island, modern Hatteras, inland river valleys, and even farther afield. Each new find is carefully analyzed but rarely provides a smoking gun. Instead, the pieces form a mosaic of contact, survival, and transformation rather than conquest or destruction. The lost colony's fate remains one of the earliest and most poignant reminders of the challenges facing Europeans in the New World. Their disappearance embodies the fragility of colonial ventures and the profound impact of cultural encounters. For historians, archaeologists, and the public alike, Roanoke symbolizes the unknown pathways between survival and loss, presence and absence. It invites reflection on how history is recorded, remembered, and reimagined. As research continues, so does the fascination with this vanished colony, the enduring question at America's frontier: what really happened to the lost colony of Roanoke? The Roanoke mystery has not only engaged historians and archaeologists but has also profoundly influenced the cultural imagination surrounding early America. The story resonates as a narrative of hope, disappearance, and the fragile nature of colonial ventures. Across centuries, it has been adapted into folklore, literature, film, and even conspiracy theories, each iteration revealing more about society's fascination with the unknown than the historical facts themselves. In American folklore, Roanoke often serves as a symbol of vanished innocence, a poignant emblem of what might have been. The figure of Virginia Dare, the first English child born in America, is particularly emblematic. Over time, she evolved into a mythic figure representing the promise and peril of the New World. Some 19th-century writers portrayed her as a martyr, while others envisioned her as a princess or prophetess. These portrayals, though fictionalized, have played a role in shaping American identity and memory. The mystery has also sparked more speculative interpretations. From suggestions that the colony was abducted by aliens to theories involving secret Spanish attacks, Roanoke has attracted fringe theories that demonstrate how deeply the story captures popular imagination. Though unsupported by evidence, these ideas highlight the void left by historical silence. In popular media, the lost colony has been depicted in countless forms. The long-running outdoor drama The Lost Colony on Roanoke Island attracts thousands each year, dramatizing the settlers' struggles and disappearance with artistic flair. Books, television series, and documentaries have continued to revisit the topic, sometimes blending history with fiction to maintain public interest. This cultural impact is not limited to entertainment. The mystery has also inspired discussions about the nature of colonization itself. Roanoke exemplifies the uncertainties and challenges faced by European powers entering territories already inhabited by established peoples. The fate of the colonists highlights the complexity of cultural encounters, marked by cooperation, conflict, adaptation, and survival. As the United States reflects on its origins, Roanoke prompts deeper questions about identity, belonging, and the narratives told about the nation's beginnings. Educationally, Roanoke is often introduced to students as an early case study of colonization failure. Yet it also offers a platform to discuss the role of indigenous peoples in shaping early American history. The narrative challenges simplistic notions of conquest and emphasizes the importance of native agency and resilience. Finally, the Lost Colonies story underscores the limits of historical knowledge. It reminds us that history is not always neat or complete. Sometimes, silence, absence, and mystery tell us as much about the past as written records or artifacts. The ongoing quest to understand Roanoke reflects a human desire to connect with those who came before, to solve puzzles left unfinished, and to honor the lives, known and unknown, that helped shape a continent. One of the enduring questions about the lost colony concerns the role of environmental factors in the settlers' fate. The Outer Banks region, with its unique geography, posed formidable challenges. The barrier islands and coastal plains are characterized by unstable soil, frequent storms, shifting sand dunes, and a fragile ecosystem. These environmental conditions would have significantly impacted the colony's ability to survive and thrive. When the Roanoke colonists arrived, they faced a harsh climate with hot, humid summers and unpredictable weather. Hurricanes and tropical storms routinely swept the coastline, capable of destroying homes, crops, and supplies. The settlers had to contend with saltwater intrusion that could damage freshwater sources and farmland. Additionally, the dense forests and marshes, while rich in resources, were difficult to navigate and cleared for agriculture only with great effort. Early English farming methods, suited to temperate European soils, often failed to adapt quickly to these conditions. Maize, a staple crop cultivated by Native Americans, required different techniques unfamiliar to the colonists. Without established native allies or local knowledge, the settlers' chances of sustaining themselves diminished. The isolation of Roanoke Island further exacerbated these problems. The colony depended heavily on supply shipments from England, but the ongoing Anglo-Spanish War delayed or prevented timely deliveries. Starvation and disease thus became persistent threats. The settlers may have tried to supplement their food sources through fishing, hunting, and trading with local tribes. Still, such efforts could not fully compensate for environmental and logistical hardships. The region's natural dangers also extended beyond agriculture. The surrounding waters contained treacherous shoals, dangerous currents, and storms that complicated travel and resupply. The English ships that first arrived struggled with navigation, and some were lost en route. These factors isolated the colony and restricted communication. As a result, the colonists were cut off during crucial periods, leading to desperation and difficult decisions. Recent environmental studies have attempted to reconstruct historical climate patterns and storm frequency in the late 16th century. These analyses suggest that a series of harsh weather events may have struck the region shortly after the colony's establishment. Severe droughts or flooding could have devastated crops, damaged shelters, and caused illness. Such conditions would have increased mortality rates and forced the colonists to seek refuge elsewhere. Environmental challenges likely influenced the colonists' decision to relocate from Roanoke Island, possibly to Croatoan Island or inland sites. These moves would have been motivated by access to better resources, safer harbors, or stronger alliances with native groups. The carving of Croatoan can be interpreted as a signal of this planned migration in response to environmental pressures. Understanding the role of nature in the lost colony's fate emphasizes that colonization was not just a human endeavor but one profoundly shaped by ecosystems. It also highlights the importance of indigenous environmental knowledge, which European settlers initially lacked. The story of Roanoke serves as an early example of how environment and culture intersect in shaping history. Another vital angle in the story of the lost colony is the nature of the relationships between the English settlers and the Native American tribes in the region. Early encounters between the two groups were complex and fluctuated between cooperation, mistrust, and conflict. The native peoples of the Carolina coast were not a single unified entity but a mosaic of tribes with distinct cultures, languages, and political systems. Among these, the Croatoan tribe stood out as especially significant in the Roanoke narrative. Their interactions with the English were initially marked by curiosity and assistance. The Croatoan provided food and guidance to the settlers and even sent emissaries, such as Manteo, to England to build diplomatic ties. These early exchanges suggested a potential for alliance and mutual benefit. However, tensions also arose. Differences in worldview, competition for resources, and misunderstandings sometimes led to conflicts. John White's reports mention occasional thefts and violent encounters. Native leaders were cautious about English intentions, wary of new settlers disrupting their established ways. The Croatoan themselves occupied a strategic position on the barrier islands, controlling access to the mainland and vital trade routes. Their support or opposition could significantly influence the settlers' chances of survival. It is plausible that the colonists' decision to relocate to Croatoan Island was in part motivated by these political considerations. Assimilation theories suggest that some colonists were absorbed into Croatoan society, marrying into families and adopting indigenous customs. This blending would have been a pragmatic strategy for survival amid dwindling supplies and isolation. Similarly, other groups like the Secatan and Chowanoke may have received remnants of the colony, creating new hybrid communities. Yet, intermarriage and cultural exchange would also mean the gradual loss of distinct English identity, contributing to the disappearance of the colony as a discrete entity. These dynamics challenge the traditional narrative of conquest and instead present a more nuanced picture of early colonial interaction, one that acknowledges negotiation, adaptation, and hybridity. Archaeological evidence, including combined European and native artifacts at sites on Croatoan Island and inland locations, supports this interpretation. Oral histories from descendant native groups also recall ancestors who intermingled with English settlers, preserving memories of shared ancestry. Ultimately, the story of Roanoke is as much about native agency as it is about English ambition. The tribes shaped the fate of the colony through their choices to assist, resist, or incorporate newcomers. Understanding these relationships is key to comprehending what truly happened at Roanoke and how the colony came to be lost not in violence or disaster, but in transformation. A significant figure in the Roanoke story is Manteo, a Native American leader who played a crucial role in early English-native relations. Manteo, a member of the Croatoan tribe, was one of the first Native Americans to establish contact with the English settlers and to travel to England as part of diplomatic efforts. His unique position as a cultural intermediary highlights the complexities of early colonial encounters. In 1584, Manteo and another Croatoan, Wanchese, accompanied an English expedition led by Sir Richard Grenville, returning to England to meet Queen Elizabeth I. These journeys were intended to promote alliances and secure English support for colonization. Manteo embraced this relationship, learning English customs and serving as a guide and interpreter. His collaboration with the settlers was pivotal in helping them navigate the unfamiliar land and forge ties with local tribes. In recognition of his loyalty, Manteo was baptized and later granted the title of Lord of Roanoke by the English. This honorary status symbolized his alliance with the colonists but also marked a profound cultural transformation. However, the alliance was not without tensions. Wanchese, in contrast, grew wary of English intentions and ultimately distanced himself, warning his people against European encroachment. This division among native leaders exemplifies the varied responses to colonization. Some saw opportunity in cooperation, while others perceived a threat to their sovereignty. Manteo's story underscores the negotiation, adaptation, and resistance that shaped early colonial dynamics. His influence likely helped ensure initial survival and may have facilitated the colonists' later relocation to Croatoan territory. Yet his role also highlights the limitations of English control in the New World, where indigenous agency remained decisive. The fate of Manteo after the lost colony's disappearance remains unclear. Some suggest he remained an influential leader, maintaining ties with the English. Others propose he returned fully to Croatoan life. Regardless, his legacy persists as a symbol of cross-cultural encounter, embodying both possibility and uncertainty. Through Manteo, we glimpse a world where identities were fluid, and alliances could shift rapidly. His story reminds us that the lost colony was not simply an isolated English venture but part of a larger, ongoing process of cultural contact and transformation that shaped the Americas. The search for the lost colony has also involved scrutinizing contemporary European records beyond England. Spanish archives, in particular, offer an intriguing, if ambiguous, perspective. Spain, as the dominant colonial power in the Americas during the late 16th century, monitored English activities closely and sought to undermine their efforts. Some Spanish reports reference English attempts to settle along the Atlantic coast and express concern over the threat these posed to Spanish claims. Spanish officials feared that the English colony might serve as a base for piracy or military operations. However, direct evidence of Spanish military action against Roanoke remains scarce. Some historians speculate that Spanish expeditions may have raided or harassed the English settlers, contributing to their disappearance. Other documents suggest Spanish ships patrolled the area to intercept English supply vessels, effectively isolating the colony. Yet, the absence of explicit Spanish accounts detailing an attack leaves the theory unconfirmed. The Spanish also had alliances with certain native tribes, which could have influenced local politics and the fate of the English colony. The complex network of native European relations meant that Spanish influence might have indirectly pressured or destabilized Roanoke settlers. Further complicating matters, Spanish records mention indigenous groups in the Carolinas but do not clearly identify English survivors among them. The limited nature of these documents means historians must interpret them cautiously. Despite uncertainties, Spanish archival material remains a valuable resource for understanding the geopolitical context surrounding Roanoke. It sheds light on the broader imperial rivalry that framed the English colony's fragile existence. The lost colony's fate thus cannot be fully understood without considering these international tensions, which affected supply routes, military support, and diplomatic relations. This perspective reminds us that Roanoke's disappearance was part of a global contest for empire, where local events were shaped by distant monarchs, wars, and shifting alliances. As the centuries passed, numerous theories emerged attempting to explain the disappearance of the Roanoke settlers. One popular theory proposed that the colonists were massacred or forcibly removed by hostile Native American tribes. Early accounts from English explorers and settlers occasionally describe violent conflicts with indigenous groups, fueling speculation that the colonists might have fallen victim to such attacks. Yet, archaeological evidence for a violent end, such as mass graves, weapon-inflicted injuries on remains, or scorched ruins, is notably absent at Roanoke Island and nearby sites. Excavations have uncovered little sign of a battle or massacre, weakening this theory. Instead, the lack of physical evidence suggests that if violence occurred, it was not on a large scale or in a way that left archaeological traces. Some historians argue that the colonists, aware of potential dangers, may have fled before violence could occur or avoided direct confrontation through diplomacy and alliances. Others propose that the word Croatoan carved into the palisade post was a deliberate message directing rescuers to a safer location under native protection. Another angle posits that the colonists integrated peacefully into native communities, adopting their customs and languages to survive. Such assimilation would explain the absence of ruins or bodies at the original site and aligns with oral histories from tribes like the Lumbee and Hatteras, who claim ancestral ties to English settlers. However, assimilation theories face challenges. Some contemporary native narratives recount encounters with English settlers, but the timelines and locations often remain unclear. Additionally, cultural and genetic intermingling over generations has made it difficult to identify distinct descendant groups conclusively. Ultimately, the violent attack theory, while dramatic and compelling, lacks substantial evidence and has been largely supplanted by more nuanced interpretations that emphasize survival strategies, migration, and cultural blending. The lost colony's fate is thus less likely to be a story of destruction and more one of adaptation and transformation.